afternoon, everyone. It is 3:05. We are here today for a meeting of the Redistricting Task Force. So I hereby call this meeting to order. Hope everyone had a good holiday season and we're ready to work. 26 maps. I want to commend you all for reviewing 26 maps. And now today, hopefully we can narrow that down and go out to the public. And so without further ado, I'm going to proceed. I am going to do something different. Since we have public presentations or public comment at the end, I'm going to move those up after approval of the minutes, because we're going to have a very long, not a very long, but we're going to have a discussion about minority opportunity districts, and then we're going to look at the maps. So I want to hear from the public before we get into the maps themselves. So with that, our first order of business is approval of the minutes from the November 17 meeting. So trust everyone has had a chance to review the minutes, and the chair will entertain a motion for approval of the minutes. Someone gonna make a motion? All right, go ahead.
I move that we approve the minutes from November.
Is there a second? All right, all in favor of approval of the minutes, say aye. Aye. All right. Motion passes. All right, so right now, I am going to take public comment or public presentations. I'm gonna move item number 7 before we talk about minority opportunity districts. So staff, do we have public comments or public presentations? Yes. We go ahead and call the first one up.
Mr. Calderon, are you ready?
I am.
Okay, and which one of your presentations would you like first? The growth rate map or the comparison?
In fact, do you have those as handouts or just as visuals?
Just as visuals.
Go ahead and do the first one and then I'll cue you.
Okay, which one did you want first, sir?
Population growth rate 2010 to 2018. Then the 2020 to 2030, and then followed with a minority supermajority.
They're going. If you'll go ahead, sir, you have your 3 minutes.
Go ahead, Mr. Calderon.
In District 8, Fort Worth grew nearly 178,000 this past decade. Half the growth, 89,000, is just shy of an average new district. This growth was spread throughout the city, as this map indicates. 32% of Fort Worth's growth was in Districts 5, 6, and 8. District 3 grew 10%. Add in District 9, and we have 44% of our total growth. As you can tell, District 7, far north, grew a bunch, 38%. And District 2 and 4 also grew, some north of 820, but not all of it. So about half of Fort Worth's total gain was in far north, and that's about one new district. Fort Worth, and as we look at the next map, which is the 2020-2030, we know that the growth is going to be occurring throughout the city. You see far west in District 3, and then you see way far south in what's District 6 and District 8. Fort Worth is over 60% minority. The second new district should be in South Fort Worth, where minorities are growing. And this projected growth rate map shows that. And the overall minority population map shows where the supermajority of combined African American and Hispanics are. The following map, please. Now, maps X, I, and Z create a Hispanic opportunity district in South Fort Worth without an incumbent. Now, its residents will select whomever they want to choose. When I lived in Northside, I first voted for Zapata, then Jim Lane, and then, of course, I also voted for Espino before I moved to District 8, where I voted for Kelly Allen Gray. People will choose the best candidate that suits their preferences, regardless of color. But I do think the second opportunity district needs to be in South Fort Worth. Communities of interest include shared socio-economic characteristics. One such characteristic is income level. Low-income communities are often not officially organized, and thus they didn't register as a community of interest. Nonetheless, they meet the definition of a community of interest and should be treated as such. This task force would benefit from viewing a Fort Worth income level distribution map, which I understand staff may be preparing one. Separate maps showing the concentration levels of Hispanics, African Americans, and whites would also be helpful. I have revised Map X to join communities of interest I mistakenly split. One block in Como, one block in Berkshire, a few blocks in South Hills, and a section of Gateway Park, no people, in East Fort Worth. In this revised map, I've moved the southern boundary of District 8 to 820. And as the boundary between Districts 3 and 9, I can use University rather than Montgomery. I'm also providing a comparison of key data in those districts most affecting minorities. I had thought that this would be handouts, not put on the screen, but do as you wish, and thank you very much for your kind attention, and especially for all your hard work.
Thank you, Mr. Calderon. Staff, any other public comments or presentations?
Mr. Herring?
If you will, Mr. Herring? Make sure the mic is on, Rick, as you take the podium. You know you're getting old when you recognize a lot of the speakers.
And you know you're getting old when you can't do anything without these. Okay, it's on. Good afternoon. Excuse me, I'm Rick Herring, moderator for the Riverside Alliance, which is a coalition of 7 neighborhood associations in the Riverside area of Fort Worth. And I join Mr. Calderon in thanking you for your service, because this is very thankless and you've had a lot to review. As I had stated at the last hearing that I spoke at, and that we've been stating for a year or so, the goal of the Riverside community is to be unified within one council district. And I think there may have been, at least from one task force member, some confusion over the area that we were working to unify, and we got that settled. But if there's, any other confusion, I'll be glad to answer any questions about that. But the map that the community of interest map that we submitted for the Riverside community does accurately represent the area that we would like to have unified in one council district. Most of the maps, prior to all of the, I won't call them late submissions, but the ones that came in after the deadline was extended, most of the maps prior to that time met our objectives, and so we were very pleased with that. And as I mentioned to you last time, so we didn't pick one that we thought was better than the other. They met our objectives, and we were happy with whichever one that the task force recommended to council. However, the ones that came in after the deadline was extended, there were a number of maps that did not meet our objectives and our goal. So obviously, we wouldn't necessarily be in favor of those. But I will tell you, I think that there's a few that have kind of risen to the top in your consideration. We are, for our purposes only, we are strongly in favor of maps X and map Z. They're almost interchangeable as far as Riverside area is concerned. Map S is also met our objectives. One that I do believe had strong consideration by the task force is map I, and that one we would not be in favor of because it splits our community along Highway 121. It basically splits it in two, so we would not be in favor of map I. But there's a number of choices out there for you, and still a lot of the maps, other than the ones I've mentioned, do keep the Riverside community intact and unified within one council district. So we respectfully request that you help us meet our objective and our goal of keeping the Riverside community unified within one council district, and we definitely appreciate all your hard work in reviewing all of this data. It seems to go on and on, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Herring. All right, staff has given me a sheet of the folks who have signed up to speak. So the next one up is Mr. Paul Wilson. You're up, sir. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. So in the morning. I'm Dr. Paul Wilson. You may have seen Dr. Paul Wilson in a couple maps online. I'm the president of the Stone Glen and Fossil Creek HOA, and speaking with support on behalf of my 6,200 neighbors in Fossil Creek HOA, one of the 3 original large developments outside the Northern Loop in Fort Worth. I'm just going to be really quick with you guys, so get your pens ready. Maps E, G, I, O, R, S, T, W, X, Y, and Z put issues from Fossil Creek in danger of becoming almost lost amongst the chatter of developers of Greater Saginaw and separate our community from our neighbors that we have worked very hard in the past to bring our shared issues to light to council. A multi-neighborhood working group of community leaders representing approximately 60,000 member residents in the North Fort Worth over a territory of about 90,000 residents in Fort Worth was formed, and we have prepared the following letters. I've distributed those letters, or they have been distributed to you. There are 2. One has community interest highlighted in green. That's the first one I'm going to speak to. The first letter, recognizing the new community of interest, is something that we're requesting to have done. This is something that we didn't fall into the timeline, but the working group asks that the recognition of a community of interest geographically defined as approximately FM 1709 to the north, Highway 377 to the east, I-820 to the south, and I-35 west to the west. This area brings in all these communities that share a lot of similar interests, were built around the same time, a lot of the similar developers, and a lot of the same school districts and whatnot. The second letter, recognizing Map S modified and Dr. Wilson's map, those are 2 maps that we published. The working group published 2 maps online. They're also referenced as maps V and U online, respectively. These maps meet the city's program criteria within the application online. We hope this reinforces what we're requesting alongside with the COI request. We worked expressly hard to preserve all COIs in our mapping efforts there. So we're hoping those both of those letters will communicate really what our intent is. We really want to group our neighbors together. And speaking as a resident of Fossil Creek, we really don't want our neighborhood to become a satellite amongst the industrial zone and amongst Saginaw. They have much more pressing issues of new development that we just don't fall under. So thank you very much for hearing me.
Mr. Wilson, can you again just repeat which maps are acceptable to the community of interest that you represent?
To an extent, Map Q, and to an extent, Map S, but we did modify both of them to bring us into what is essentially District 4.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Next up is Susan Kenny, president of the Park Glen Neighborhood Association, and Mr. Wilson was president of Stone Glen at Fossil Creek Homeowners Association.
Yes, thank you. I'm Susan Kenny, president of the Park Glen Neighborhood Association. We are the first master plan community developed in Fort Worth by Ross Perot Jr. and his development company. We are a close-knit community of 3,317 homes. We have social events throughout the year. For example, on Thanksgiving Day, we held a turkey trot, which had 500 participants. And a week later, we held a holiday in the park event, which had 800 attendees. We communicate with our community through a monthly newsletter, through our website, and through Facebook. We are hoping it was an oversight that the City Council recommended Map R, which divides our community into 2 City Council districts. Our community has been in 1 City Council district since its inception, and not being in 1 district for our neighborhood would greatly reduce our ability to communicate with our community and elected officials. We also were registered as a community of interest by our Planned Improvement District number 6. It's number 21, PID 6, Park Glen area. We appreciate all the work that the Redistricting Task Force has done in establishing guidelines for the redistricting process. We feel strongly that we should, per the redistricting guidelines, be in a district with our nearby communities of which we share similar interests and concerns. Those nearby communities are, but are not limited to, Heritage, Parkwood Hill Estates, Summerfields, and Fossil Creek. We are requesting that our geographic area, defined as approximately 1709 to the north, 377 to the east, 820 to the south, and 35 to the west, be considered a community of interest and be kept in 1 City Council district. Our communities have worked together in the past on items of concern in our area and will have concerns and interests in the future. Some examples of these interests and concerns are on our local Keller School District, roads, parks, and zoning. We formed a neighborhood working group of these neighborhoods and collectively created 2 maps, Wilson Map S modified, which is known as Map V, and Dr. Wilson's map, Map U, on the city's website. Dr. Wilson's map, Map U, is very similar to Map Q, and with a little tweaking by professionals in redistricting, could have all communities of interest remain intact in one city council district. Our Park Glen community of approximately 10,000 residents strongly requests that our Park Glen neighborhood remain in one city council district, and that our neighborhood group, representing about 60,000 residents and defined as 1709 to the north, 377 to the east, 820 to the south, and 35 to the west, be considered a community of interest and remain in the same city council district, such as in Map V or U, so that our area may have a voice and communicate effectively with our elected officials. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Kenny. Next up is Rusty Fuller. Is Rusty here or online? No, they're going to call him? Okay. We'll wait to hear from Rusty. If he doesn't answer, I'll come back to him at the end, and we'll try one last time, because we do want public input. So let's move on to Fernando Flores with the United Hispanic Council.
Hello.
Mr. Flores, this is Sal Espino here with the Redistricting Task Force. We decided to move up, or the chair decided to move up the public comment before we hear the rest of the presentations today, so we get input from the public as we move forward on redistricting. So we're calling you now, sir, to go ahead and provide your public input and comment on these maps and on redistricting. So you will have 3 minutes, and we'd like to hear from you as a representative of the United Hispanic Council. Sir, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you. Redistricting Task Force members, city staff, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Fernando Flores. I reside at 2740 Hemphill here in Fort Worth in City Council District 9. This is an unusual and time, and the redistricting process has been long and arduous. I, for one, appreciate the work that all of you are doing on the task force and also city staff. Mr. Chairman and members, I represent the United Hispanic Council, and we have submitted 3 maps to you and written information that should be in your hands now. With a 35% Hispanic population in the 2020 census, the city has only one representative on the city council. It's time to correct this lack of fair representation. Hispanics deserve and want more representation, and it can be done by creating a second Hispanic Opportunity District. The only way or place where that can be done is in the city's south side, where there is enough or a high concentration of Hispanic population. That's what we've done with our map, City Council District 10, and indicated by the demographics we went beyond just looking at raw census data and creating our map. We looked at geographic, socioeconomic data and how precincts vote in elections, as I discussed in the material that you have in your hands. If Fort Worth is serious about creating more diversity on the city council, as I often hear, I repeat, the only way to do that is by creating a Hispanic district in the South Side. Some minor tweaking and combining maps X, I, and Z may be needed. That's what we are asking you to do, and we appreciate it if you would give us a lot of consideration. Please contact me if you have any questions about this, and you can get to my number from city staff, but I'll give it to you again, 817-239-0578. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Flores, for your comments. Appreciate it. Next up is Mr. Bruce Miller. Mr. Miller, you have the floor for 3 minutes if you're here or online.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Good. So Bruce Miller here for Citizens for Independent Redistricting. The Redistricting Task Force developed 10 criteria for the creation of the new 10-district map for the city. The city staff used them to construct a report card for each submitted map. We wish to focus awareness on 2 of the criteria: communities of interest and location of council member residences. For communities of interest, the staff computed the number of district boundaries intersected by COI boundaries and inserted it in an algorithm. Ideally, in a perfect map, there would be none. The staff chose a 25% cutoff for an acceptable map, 25 to 50% for marginal acceptable. Please consider, citizens submitting maps didn't know the formula or the rules for meeting the criteria. Chart 2, can you show my chart there?
Yeah. We see it now.
Okay, thank you. Okay, chart 2 shows the distribution map scores. Staff plans are in orange, citizen and council plans are in blue. Staff plans achieved superior COI scores, which is not surprising. The chart shows that citizen plans made an effort to respect the COI boundaries, but staff plans had the advantage. Initially, staff plans were overwhelmingly favored by the task force. Fortunately, the perception changed in the second straw poll. Let's consider council member residences. According to criteria number 10, the location of existing council residences were to be ignored so as not to bias the design of the new districts. Let's look at chart number 3. Each residence is represented by a flag. Note that every council-drawn map keeps each residence in its own district. Keeping present residences in separate districts simply adds one more constraint on what can be achieved. Please show the rest of the map so you can see that. While the staff listed this item on the report card, it was not addressed. My colleague Byrick Ellison will demonstrate that this constraint makes it more difficult to achieve the best possible minority representation. This is just one reason why we favor an independent commission, to ensure that the interests of incumbents do not cloud the interests of the community. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Appreciate your presentation and thank you for your comments. Next up is Mr. Byrick Ellison. You're up, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Espino. Ms. Bruner, do you have my charts fired up?
There is a PowerPoint called Minority Demographics, Redistricting Task Force Meeting, January 6, 2022.
Okay, all right. I'm not seeing it on my screen, but if you have it before you, great. I'm Byron Ellison with Citizens for Independent Redistricting Fort Worth. Up to now, there's been a lot of attention given to residential communities of interest, but not a lot of focus on minority demographics. So I'd like to address how the minority interests are served by these various plans. And what I'm going to do here is put a sea of numbers in front of you, which I really regret, but it's got to be done. So first on this chart, let's see how many minority districts are in each plan. This table here shows all 26 plans from A to Z, and for each plan, just along the left side, you see various levels of minority representation. I'm going to focus on just two lines. In blue, the number of Hispanic majority districts by voting age in each plan, and in green, the number of Black districts with 30% or more by voting age. Now, right away, you see on the green line that it's very easy to draw maps with districts that have 30% or more Black residents. Some plans even have 3 districts with 35%, but that comes at the expense of the Hispanic bloc. On the other hand, the number of majority Hispanic districts is all over the place. Plans E and I, for example, from the United Hispanic Council and the new Roadrunner plans W and Y carve out 3 majority Hispanic districts, but you'll notice that the UHC plans still had 3 Black controlled districts, while W and Y only have 1 potential Black controlled district. That's a really bad trade-off. Now, it's more common to see just 1 or 2 majority Hispanic districts, and there's even one plan, F, that has 0. The 2 council plans, R and S, just have 1 majority Hispanic district. But to see whether the Black and Hispanic communities have to share these districts or they have separate spheres of influence, we've got to dig deeper. So let's go to page 3. And here again, there we go. Again, we have all 26 plans. And the first column of numbers, there are 2 columns of numbers. Well, the first column shows Hispanic percentages. Districts with more than 50% voting age population are colored blue. The second column are the Black percentages in the same district, with the 30% or higher colored in green. Now take a look, for instance, at staff plan Q. That one has 2 Hispanic majority districts and 3 Black influence districts. But one of those districts is set up to be a contest between a large Black population and a large Hispanic population, so that really you only have 4 minority opportunity districts. Oh,
We're still seeing that continue. Yes. Oh, it's on mute. You're on mute. Take your mute off, or staff take his mute off. There we go. We can hear you now, Mr. Ellison. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I'm sorry. I accidentally muted myself.
Keep going.
All of the staff plans are like this. On the other hand, the Calderon plan, for example, Plan X, has 2 majority Hispanic districts and 3 Black controlled districts in different districts for a total of 5 potential minority opportunity districts. UHC plans I and Z are on the same order. And all you have to do there is just count the number of total colored districts in each plan. There have already been 2 straw polls conducted by the task force to identify your top 5 or 6 plans, and yet there's been almost no analysis of minority representation, at least in the public eye. So I hope that you will take this information into consideration as you move forward, because this is one of your highest priorities. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Ellison. I will say that we are having a discussion on opportunity districts, and the task force has been briefed on the legal criteria for opportunity districts. And of course, with the extension of time to take more input on maps, the task force has had to review 26 different maps. So again, thanks everyone for their comments, and I want to thank again each task force member because this is a tough job to look at all the data for 26 different maps and then remember all the legal criteria. And there's sort of a unique balancing act between communities of interest, because everybody wants to stay in their same council district or stay together, and then the legal criteria on, we don't want to dilute minority opportunity districts, and we also want to create as as many opportunity districts that we can. So there is a little bit of, not a little bit, there is a balancing act. And, you know, as we go forward today, we're going to have a good discussion. So with that, I think that concludes the public comment, at least to the sheet that's been presented. Has anyone else signed up before we started this meeting? Yes. Oh. Okay, let's try Mr. Fuller again. Thank you. Rusty is the former president of the North Fort Worth Alliance, which is an alliance of neighborhoods in far North Fort Worth. And again, I'm getting old because I know him through the years.
This is Rusty.
Rusty Fuller, this is Sal Espino, chairman of the Redistricting Task Force. You're on the line with the Redistricting Task Force city staff, and we want to hear your comments because I moved up the public comment from the end to the beginning so we could hear from the public before we begin to evaluate maps. So go ahead, sir. You have 3 minutes for your public comment and public presentation.
Thanks, Sal. Thank you very much, Task Force, for giving us this opportunity. I'm Rusty Fuller. I'm president of the North Fort Worth Alliance. We represent some 27,000 homes up here in the north. And we would just like to have you make sure that you take a look at the map called Dr. Wilson. We submitted that map amongst other with a multi-neighborhood group to try to represent groups that have common issues here in the north. And by doing that, we believe that those groups will be better represented. So we ask that you, in all of your deliberations with all of the different things you have to consider, that you not lose sight of the fact that there are a lot of issues that are neighborhood related, and having those neighborhood issues reflected in the districting and the redistricting is very important. So we support the Dr. Wilson submission, and also for the community of interest for the Fossil Creek, PID 6, and North Fort Worth Alliance up to 1709, as outlined by Susan Kinney earlier. Thank you very much.
Appreciate that, Rusty. Thank you very much. Yes, sir. Come up to the microphone, identify yourself again.
This is Paul Wilson. So Rusty and Susan and I were reinforcing those 2 letters that were submitted to you, supporting maps V and U.
All right, thank you
very much, and the COI.
So, any other public presentations or comments? Anyone else signed up to speak? Am I missing anyone? All right, hearing none, then we move on to the next item on our agenda, which is minority opportunity districts. Ms. Guzman, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chairman, Task Force. I'm really here to just introduce our next 2 speakers. I did want to kind of tee them up by going over in public the email that I sent to you all and said that I would go over in public. But you know, this issue of minority opportunity districts has been one that we've been grappling with, as you know, for a while. I think what we all hoped for was somebody that could come to us and tell us definitively, yes, this exact percentage for this particular minority group is exactly what you need to create a minority opportunity district. We wanted something definitive. And what we've learned, what I've learned over time, and what I'm now sharing with you, is that it's much more subjective than that. Typically what will happen, what our outside counsel has told us, is what will happen in litigation after a jurisdiction is sued, they will go out and seek the advice and the expertise of a political scientist to come in and parse through the data, parse through the voting records, and tell them, for the purposes of putting on evidence in court, whether or not that percentage was sufficient in order to create a minority opportunity district. But having those political scientists come in on the front end is just simply not done. The local jurisdictions across the state will just use their own knowledge of the area, their own expertise of their neighborhoods, and they will decide, looking at the map, whether they think that those percentages are sufficient. However, with that said, we know that you all would like some additional guidance. So what we've done is I've asked Philip Arnold with Bickerstaff to go over again the legal angle of minority opportunity districts. And then I'm happy to say that after he has finished speaking, and you all have asked him any questions that you may have from a legal perspective, we are honored to have Professor Xavier, let me make sure I'm getting it right up here, and I don't want to get it wrong, Xavier Medina Vidal. And he is a professor at my alma mater where I got my political science degree. He is a professor there in the political science department. He's the associate director at the Center for Mexican American Studies there, as well as an associate professor of political science and Mexican American Studies. And he has a 16-page long CV, which I will just summarize by saying he is a frequent writer and speaker on Latino politics. He's been in mass media, TV, radio, blogs, podcasts, you name it, he's been on it. So he's going to come and talk to you about Latino voting behavior, and specifically to Fort Worth, and hopefully give you some guidance, some additional guidance as you all decide which one of these maps that you think would create the best opportunities. So without further ado, I will ask Philip Arnold, he is remote today because he has graciously agreed to appear with us while he's on vacation overseas. I will advance the slides for him as he speaks.
Welcome. Continue, please.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, task force members. And I want to just commend the public of everything I've read and been following your process. You all have done a great job, I think, reaching out to the community. So I think you all have a lot of good input, a lot of good information before you. What I'd like to do is just briefly recap, I think, what a lot of you know, and I'll run through these first slides pretty quickly, and just go over the legal requirements of what the Constitution requires and what the Voting Rights Act requires. The first is one person, one vote, and this is really our 10% deviation. So this just talks about the most populous district and the least populous district can be 10% off from each other as far as total population between the two. If we could go to the next slide. So this is an example of that. I've showed you all this before, and this just shows a city with a population of 40,000 where the ideal size would be 10,000, and it shows you how you would get to the deviation. So in this case, District A would be your largest, District D would be your smallest, and you add those two percentages together to get a 30% deviation between your biggest and smallest districts. So every plan I've seen obviously does that, complies with that criteria. If we go on to the next slide, please. What I really want to focus on was the jingles test, and this is kind of the threshold test for a Voting Rights Act lawsuit under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And this is a Supreme Court case, jingles, and in that case, the Supreme Court laid out a three-part test to determine, as a threshold matter, is a redistricting plan, or can someone actually sue for violation under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act? And so the first part of this is what I think we really need to focus on, and what I'll talk about in more detail in the later slides, is whether the minority group is sufficiently large and geographically compact to be able to constitute a majority in a single member district. And I think a lot of the things I've read and seen, and a lot of the comments have focused on this. And I think, as you all have seen, is that particularly as it relates to the Hispanic community, is that it is kind of spread out throughout the city. So you could say that, well, they comprise a certain percentage of the population of the city of Fort Worth, but they may not necessarily all reside in the same geographic area, which can make it difficult to draw a district that creates a 50% plus majority of Hispanics. And the other part of the test, the other two parts of the test, are that the minority group must be politically cohesive, and that is that they vote for the same people, or they have the same political ideology. And then the last part is that the majority, typically the white majority, would vote as a block to defeat the minority choice. So these are the threshold things we look at. I like to focus more on that first part of the test, because this really gets to what a minority opportunity district is or could possibly be. If we could go to the next slide, please. And so the ultimate section 2 test is if those 3 threshold factors under Jingles are met, then the question becomes whether under the totality of the circumstances, which is a kind of a legal term of art that all the lawyers who are listening are familiar with, but really just means based on everything you know and see, does the plan afford the protected minority group an opportunity to participate in the political process and elect a candidate of their choice? So that's really what you want to look at overall. I mean, I think this is kind of the real driving force behind Section 2. It's the intent of Section 2 as the Supreme Court case law tells us. If we could go on to the next slide, please. So under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, of course, you want to avoid packing and cracking. We've talked about that before, cracking being dividing minority groups amongst many districts, and packing being to put all the minorities into one group. And we could kind of flip through the next slides pretty quickly. These are just kind of examples of it. And so this would be an example of cracking where the red people will be the minority group in this situation, and you can see how they're broken out into 3 different districts to dilute their vote so that the blue group has a majority in all 3 districts. If we could go to the next one. And packing is the opposite of that. So you can see here where in yellow, all of the red people are packed together into one district to basically give them the opportunity to elect one district member, but not any more than that. And then the final example is where you could evenly divide them. So in this example, you have District 3, which would elect arguably a blue candidate. And then Districts 1 and 2 would have majority red voters and could elect a candidate of their choosing. So this would be an example of maximizing the minority group's impact amongst the 3 districts. If we can move on to the next slide. So what I want to talk about is what Section 2 doesn't require. And Section 2 doesn't mandate that you have a proportional or proportionality of electoral success. So by that I mean that Section 2 doesn't require that if you have 30% of a certain minority group in your city or your county or your state that they elect 30% of the elected members. That's not what Section 2 stands for. But if you do have that, that could be a defense in the suit. And then I also want to touch just briefly on political discrimination and gerrymandering, as political gerrymandering is not prohibited. And the Supreme Court has basically kind of has 2 arguments for that. One is that redistricting is inherently a political process. So no matter what you do, politics is always going to be involved. The second part of that is that the Supreme Court really just does not want to get into partisan issues like that. It's much easier to stay out of that fight, and they have chosen to repeatedly, despite being asked to over and over again. So as far as the Voting Rights Act is concerned, the Supreme Court is concerned, political ideology is not a factor under Section 2. And of course, the city has nonpartisan elections, so that shouldn't matter in Fort Worth in your process as well. But it's just worth repeating. There is a caveat to that, though, that to the extent a minority group does identify with the political party, if you discriminate against that political party, it could be an indication that you're discriminating against that minority, just kind of using partisanship as a straw man, essentially. So you really want to look at the effect of what the redistricting does. That's really what Section 2 gets at, and that's the ultimate test when we look at the totality of the circumstances. Is what's the ultimate effect of the redistricting process? And if we could go to the next slide, please. So the 14th Amendment, which is similar to the Voting Rights Act, Section 2, but under the 14th Amendment, if you're challenging that, you have to show a legislative intent to discriminate. So essentially, you have to show that they, whoever they is, be it the city council or the state or a county or a school board, actively sought to discriminate against the minority group. This can be very difficult to do because it's very difficult to prove what people are thinking, but you can do it. So it's something to be aware of. I don't think it's anything we've seen with any of these plans. I don't see it as a concern in Fort Worth in your redistricting process, but I just wanted to mention it as something to be aware of. If we could go to the next slide, please. So really getting to the heart of the matter is we know under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is that you should not discriminate based on race. You cannot discriminate based on race. But the other end of that spectrum is Shaw versus Reno, which is a Supreme Court case involving the state of North Carolina, Reno being Jannette Reno, who was the United States Attorney General at the time. And this case said that race cannot be the predominant factor in the redistricting process to the subordination of other traditional districting principles. Now, other traditional districting principles you will find in the criteria Fort Worth has adopted, and these are essentially keeping communities of interest together, following natural boundaries such as roads, rivers, creeks, things like that, compactness, all the other redistricting principles and criteria you have. So essentially, you can't make race your overriding factor and exclude all those other factors. And so if we could go to the next slide, I believe this was the map that was challenged in Shaw versus Reno. And I think it's a good example of what can happen even if you have maybe altruistic good intentions. You can see District 12 there in yellow. This was the district the legislature drew in North Carolina that was challenged. District 12 was drawn to be a second majority African American district in North Carolina. Before this, there was only one. The legislature decided to draw a second one, and this was the district they chose to draw. It essentially follows a highway cuts through the middle of North Carolina. And you can see it's a crazy shape. It is not compact in the least bit, but it did create a second majority African American district in North Carolina. So that would maybe be a good thought, a good plan, a good thing to do would be to create a second majority African American district. But when you look at how they did it, that's where they got into trouble. That was the basis of the suit. And that's one of the main things that the Supreme Court focused on. So I just want to show you this map to kind of show you what was going on in Shaw versus Reno, because when you hear these cases, talk about them, it's good to have, in my opinion, a visual reference to look at so you know what were they doing here? Are we doing anything like that? None of the maps I've seen do anything like this. So I don't see this as being a really big problem in Fort Worth, but it's just something I wanted to make you all aware of. If we could go to the next slide. So what we really wanted to talk about today was minority opportunity districts. Again, we have to comply with the Voting Rights Act and Shaw versus Reno. So these are kind of the bookends. Voting Rights Act says you can't discriminate based on race, and Shaw versus Reno says you can't use race as your overriding factor. So you have to balance those two. According to the case law from the Supreme Court, a minority group must possess the potential to elect a representative of their choosing if they sue. If they're going to challenge a map, a minority group must prove that they have the potential to elect a representative of their choosing. Otherwise, they cannot claim to be injured. So that means that they have to have the ability to do it. It doesn't matter if they say that they can. They have to show that they have the ability to elect who they want to elect. And if they can't, they just don't pass that first part of the Jingles test, which is showing that they have to have a majority minority district. And there are cases out there, and a Supreme Court case in particular, that talks about what is that threshold number. And this is something I know you all have been struggling with, and that I've talked a lot about with Ms. Guzman, is how do we identify what a minority opportunity district is? And according to the Supreme Court, and this was a more, probably a majority conservative Supreme Court at the time, but certainly more liberal than the Supreme Court is now. So I can arguably say that the court is probably not going to change its mind on what it said in this case, is that minority groups are not entitled to the maximum possible voting strength that can be created by the redistricting process. So that means that you don't have to maximize minority districts. This also applies to what this case in particular was talking about, which was what they called a crossover district. And I think what you all are referring to as a minority opportunity district, they're really the same thing. And what the case was discussing was whether the Voting Rights Act, the threshold, that first part of the Jingles test, do you have to have a 50% plus one minority group in order to get past the first part of the Jingles test? And the Supreme Court said, yes, you do. There was a lot of discussion about it. There were dissents that had good opinions as well. But again, the dissents were obviously in the minority and in the liberal minority. So the case said that crossover districts where a combination of a group of minority voters could theoretically be stitched together in order to elect a minority candidate, that does not count as a 50% plus one. So you can't have, for example, 40% Hispanic and 50 or 11% African American, cobble those two together and say, well, this is a majority minority district. It has to be, according to the Supreme Court, the same race or the same group identity, however you want to define that. But it cannot just be a group of minorities stitched together. And that may even include white voters in some cases, and that's what this case talked about. So the Supreme Court really drew a hard line and said that if you're going to bring a Voting Rights Act case under Section 2, you have to have 50% plus one of a particular minority group in order to satisfy the first part of the Jingles test. If we could go to the next slide, please. So the Supreme Court in this case also said that a governmental entity is only required to draw districts in a way that provides minority voters with a fair number of districts in which they have an opportunity to elect a candidate of their choice. However, Section 2 does allow entities to choose their own method of complying with the Voting Rights Act, which may include drawing crossover districts or minority opportunity districts. So what this is really saying is that you're not required to draw minority opportunity districts, but you can draw them if you choose to. And Fort Worth has chosen that as one of their criteria. And so it is something you can consider. But again, bring you back to Shaw versus Reno, because it's important to note that you can't use race as your overriding factor. So if you look at all other factors and decide that it is in the interest of Fort Worth, in the city, that you draw, select a certain plan that you have before you, and you have 26 of them, so you have a lot of options. you can consider crossover districts or minority opportunity districts. You just don't want race to be your overriding factor. So you're not required to do it, but you can do it. But you have to be careful about how you do it and how you consider it, because again, you don't want race being your overriding factor, because that will bring a challenge, or could bring a challenge under Shaw versus Reno. And I believe that are the end of my slides. Is that right, Ms. Guzman?
Yes, that's right.
Yes.
So if you all have any questions for him at this point, we can entertain those before we move on.
Any questions? Yes, Ms. Boyd.
Yeah, my question is, I hear what you're saying about the law and what Fort Worth chose to do, but you've also said that you looked at the 26 maps, right?
I've looked at a lot of them.
A lot of them.
I have not looked at every single one. I can't profess to do that, but I think I've probably looked at about 15 to 20 of them. Yeah.
His firm will review the top 5 that you select today.
Okay. Okay.
I have a question. Obviously, the Voting Rights Act is like, what I envision is the floor. You can always do more than what is legally allowable. Like, let's say, like you said down there under Section 2, you can include crossover or even, maximize minority opportunities if you're not required to maximize, right? Am I hearing that correctly? Or let me rephrase that. The Voting Rights Act, has this criteria, but the council can always go above and beyond that, provided you do not use race as the predominant factor. Am I hearing that correctly?
Yes, sir. So as long as race isn't the predominant factor, you can maximize or create and look at minority opportunity districts. So the Supreme Court said that in this case, but they also said you're not obligated to do it either.
Fair enough. But the Jingles test does provide a legal minimum, though. If there is an opportunity to create a minority opportunity districts by complying with the voting right, you would need to do a minority opportunity district, right? In other words, if you can find a district where the community there is, let's say, 50 plus voting age population Hispanic, you could create a Hispanic, I wouldn't want to use the word Hispanic, but an opportunity district where 50% or more of that community, of course, provided to meet all the other tests, if they vote as a block and they've been prevented for by the majority, you would be, then the law would require you to have an opportunity district there, right?
I wouldn't necessarily say it's a requirement. I would say it definitely gets a plaintiff in the door. Okay. So what the Jingles test is about is what a plaintiff has to initially prove in order to just not have their case thrown out of court. And if they can get past that, then you actually get to the facts of the case that say, that, they drew this map because they were discriminating against us and on and on and on.
I got you.
But it's really a threshold question.
I got you. That's a good clarification. Thank you. Any other questions, legal questions on minority opportunity districts? Thank you.
Thank you all.
Okay, and now that I'd ask for Professor Medina Vidal to come up.
Welcome, Professor.
Thank you.
You can advance it by just pushing that down.
Oh, that's hello.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the task force, for having me. I am not I don't have all the answers. Thank you for the introduction, Leann, but I'm going to try to do my part in educating the task force a little bit on Latino political behavior. So my background is more general than the task that you have at hand right now. So I'm going to do so by going through some theoretical and empirical evidence from political science research from some of my colleagues who I know personally, and I trust their research very much. So I'm going to be citing them here in a minute. So I'm going to start by talking about frameworks of Latino voting behavior, the effects of majority-minority districts on turnout, and get out the vote. What does that look like in Hispanic communities? So the first part here, there are, generally speaking, three broad frameworks And a fourth one that I think is sort of the one that fits most for our task here today. The frameworks for understanding how Latinos vote in elections, how they participate in politics. The first of these is the ethnic approach. The ethnic approach says that, or scholars in this camp approach Latino political behavior comparatively, in the sense that that political scientists study different national origin groups and how they behave relative to other national origin groups. So Mexicans and Cubans, how they are different in their political behavior, how are they the same, and all of that sort of questions. The ethnic approach questions this idea that Latinos vote as a bloc, right? So a lot of the assumptions that we have in political science, and some that have been mentioned already today, we're making assumptions that people as a group, as a bloc, are going to vote the same way, right? And while there's some evidence for that, there's some empirical evidence for general patterns of behavior, it's important to just put it out there that we're making these assumptions when we talk about these frameworks. The second category or framework is demography is destiny. And this is very popular in the media, along with the pivotal vote framework, the third one here, because the demography is destiny approach suggests that just by virtue of population growth, that Latinos are going to become more politically influential, that they're going to influence the process, they're going to influence political outcomes just by virtue of their growth. And this is something that again, it captures the attention, it captures the media's attention, and it forces people to maybe think about the community in a different way than maybe they hadn't before. But it is not in itself a recipe for achieving political influence or for achieving political power. In the 1980s, 1990s, or I should say since the 1980s and 1990s, political scientists and analysts generally have talked about the Hispanic community as a sleeping giant, right? So this is kind of, it's a little bit insulting to say that your community has been asleep and needs to be woken up for some reason. But the narrative is all around population change. When what we know from your work, we know that what's at hand here is citizen voting age population, right? And those who are eligible to participate in the electoral process. That's the population that actually matters. The pivotal vote, similar to the demography is destiny framework, there's a market for that in the sense that it allows a sort of media and analysts to pursue this idea that Latinos vote as a bloc. Again, not really parsing through the different nuances of the Hispanic community in terms of their political behavior. And it's just as imprecise and formulaic as this demography is destiny approach. And so the fourth one here that I have down here, state and local context and process-oriented mobilizing opportunities. This is a newer sort of way of thinking about Latino political behavior that suggests that state and local context is what sort of frames all of it, because we tend to think of Latino politics sort of every few years, and in the context of redistricting, we think about Latino political behavior, and then we forget about it for a few years, then we come back to it, but it's always sort of at the national level. And so I want to say also that much of the research in political science tends to focus on congressional elections, and sort of when we talk about redistricting and that process, what it looks like for affecting turnout among minority communities. It's usually around congressional districts and to a lesser extent, state legislative elections in that context as well. But this, the idea of paying attention to local context and process-oriented mobilizing opportunities is a way to suggest that there are, while demographic change matters, it matters how it's happening and where it's happening, and in relation to a number of other factors. So here in Fort Worth, according to the framework of mobilizing state and local mobilizing opportunities, would be considered a high growth, high presence context. So we have a high rate of growth of Latino population. We know that statewide. That is the broader conversation that we're having in Texas, right? So we already have an established community, but it's one that's also growing. But it's not the same sort of community that's growing, right? It's growing, but it's also much more socioeconomically diverse, and diverse in terms of national origin as well, more so than in previous decades. So there are emergent, dynamic, moderate, and established types of context, and I think our context here fits more under the high growth, high presence, dynamic context. And so in order to establish mobilizing opportunities that are structured by the context, in order to be able to answer this Latino political behavior or participation question, we have to establish that presence and growth, Latino presence and Latino population growth are preconditions for political influence, but they are not in themselves measures of political influence. Something else I want to mention, there are three important groups that are important to understanding the Latino political behavior puzzle, and they are the following. So recruits are young people who are coming of age, who are turning 18 and becoming part of the citizen voting age population, and immigrants. So immigrants who are legal permanent residents that, if they were to be naturalized by some sort of political reform, together, youth and these newly naturalized immigrants would account for about 16 million would-be new eligible voters in the United States. The second group, reticents. Reticents are unregistered voters of voting age. And reluctants. Reluctants are those who are registered but are just not voting. Together, these two groups, the reticents and the reluctants, account for about 40 million potential new participants. So that's why we get to this number of, between these groups, recruits, reticents, and reluctants, we're looking at about 56 million new potential voters. And so this is where we get to that. When we think about huge numbers like these, this is where we get to sort of think about the significance of demographic change, but also this 40-plus year narrative that suggests that Latinos are this sleeping giant, right? Because we know that there are communities out there. It is so diverse socioeconomically speaking. There are mixed status families, sharing the same household. The patterns of political behavior are just not monolithic. And so this is what we need to consider. And so the next part here is specific to this question of majority, minority districts, and voter turnout. So how do majority minority districts affect electoral participation? There are two broad schools of thought on this. The first of these, disillusionment. The disillusionment school says that in safe majority minority districts, the outcome is as invariant as the outcomes in the majority white or minority vote diluted context. Yes, outcomes are better for the minority group. That is, that they have these opportunities to win, and they do win, but the incentive to participate is repeatedly undermined by the irrelevance of turnout to the outcome. In addition, the assumption that incumbents are then unbeatable and the reluctance of primary challengers to emerge from within the group reduces competition in these environments. The second, again, these are broad schools of thought. There's quite a bit of room for nuance in here, but the empowerment school says that once descriptive representation is secured through the creation of majority minority districts, minority voters no longer face the discouragement associated with repeated votes and zero victories, and they participate more. So when I was asked to contribute to this discussion, I went through, as I said, this is not my specific area of focus. I deal more in the context of transnational political behavior. But I have colleagues who have been doing this work for quite some time. And I was able to identify two studies that sort of capture one, on the one hand, the disillusionment, on the other hand, the empowerment sort of view on this, or these schools of thought. And so on the one hand, we find, or political science research finds, that there are positive effects on Latino turnout propensity when you have, so the effects of turnout, of higher turnout are seen when you have additional layers of representation or of descriptive representation. That is, if you have a Latino city council member and a Latino state rep and a Latino state senator and a member, U.S. House member, right? So these effects are there. They're just, they're magnified when you have these additional Latino district layers. It's important to say that in this particular finding, when I say positive effects on Latino turnout propensity, this is in the context of studying state legislative, that is state House, state Senate, and U.S. Congress elections between 1996 and 2000. This is this context of this first study that I'm citing. And turnout, and when I say turnout is higher, or the propensity increases, that is compared to Latinos that are not in these majority minority districts, Latinos participate more. So yes, so we know that Latinos participate less than any other group, but when you have Latinos, when you have these layers of descriptive representation, you see more Latinos turning out for elections than in contexts in which you don't have these layers. The second study here is about comparing Latinos to non-Latinos. So, right. So in the first context, we're studying, we're studying Latinos with representation versus Latinos without representation. Here we're talking about what are the effects of majority-minority districts on different ethno-racial groups. And here we find actually that in the short term, compared to Black, Asian, and white voters who are moved by having co-ethnic representation, and they do participate more when they have the ability to elect a co-ethnic, and when they are moved into, that is, when the district lines are redrawn and they're moved into a majority, we'll take African Americans, moved into a majority Black district, then they do respond and they do participate more. That is not the case for Latinos. It's not the case for Latinos in the short term that when you move Latinos into a new majority Latino district, that they're going to suddenly start participating more. And this is why I wanted to put it out there, because the research on this is mixed, right? On the one hand, it's optimistic, it's empowering. If you think about Latinos in districts with descriptive representation versus those without it, they are going to participate more. But compared to other groups, compared to African American, Asian, and white, it's not the case. So I wanted to put that out there to also suggest that, something that many of us already know, but I think it needs to be reinforced, is that especially in cities like Fort Worth, we have a tremendous amount of socioeconomic diversity within the Latino community. And this is something that I think should be considered, should be addressed, right? We're having this conversation about what to do, using race as a condition, or what are the requirements for that. But we also need to pay attention to, what else is going on besides race in terms of the representation for Latino communities, especially as it relates to socioeconomic status and many mixed status families as well. And the last thing I'm going to say is a little bit about what works in terms of getting out the vote, because we know that all the research suggests that Latinos are participating and have participated historically at rates lower than other ethno-racial groups. And so I wanted to say, in addition to asking that the task force pay attention to the diversity within the Latino community, also think about what are those other resources in the community that could help mobilize Latinos to participate. And so much of the research on this comes from the 1920s, mid-1920s, in the context of field experiments done in large cities. Back then, they've been sort of adapted to address the needs or adapted to help us understand Latino political participation. And what do we find that works most of all? Door-to-door, live phone banking, increases turnout by about 40%. One-on-one in-person canvassing is what produces the strongest effects. And something that ties into what I was saying about socioeconomic diversity and just diversity among within the Hispanic community in general is that appealing to Hispanic, you can appeal to sort of middle and upper class Latinos to get them to vote. You need to appeal to their American identity, but to appeal to those sort of at the lower socioeconomic scale, they're more responsive to appealing to Latino or even immigrant identity in terms of getting them to mobilize and to participate. So in other words, context, culture, and identity matter a great deal within the Hispanic community, and this is why it's such an important topic, but it's much more complex, right? It's much more complex. It's hard to paint it with broad strokes, and this is why I wanted to say a couple of these things here to this group. Tailoring messages to the individual voter and local. So what we do know is that local issues matter the most, actually, to Latinos. So we know that that they respond the most to things happening within the community. And so that's actually a good thing for those of us interested in studying state and local politics. And finally, the messenger matters. Neighbors are more effective mobilizers than community leaders than at mobilizing voters. Personal stories, citizenship stories, all of that narrative. As long as you can tap into Latinos' linked fate, so you can have wealthy or middle class Latinos. If you can tap into their linked fate with every other Latino out there, which means a very diverse group of people, then you're going to have the most success in terms of mobilizing them to vote. But again, the last, what I want to emphasize is that it's just not a monolith. It's hard to sort of pin it down, and I've given you a semester's worth of political behavior in my time allotted here. So thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Just to wrap up, I wanted to make one quick statement that to explain why we had someone focus on Latino voting behavior. And I think you know why, but I just want to make sure that it's clear that we have some really good data on the performance of our African American minority opportunity districts. And I think what this group is struggling with is the addition of a Hispanic minority opportunity district. And that's why we focused on this. So I just wanted to make that statement.
Does anyone have any questions from Ms. Guzman or the presenter? Yes, Mr. Bradshaw.
So with respect to voting age population, is that just succinctly people that are over the age of 18 that belong to that race or ethnic?
Yes.
It doesn't take into account if someone is, say, a DACA person that is over 18 but doesn't have the right to vote. Or do I get that?
I'll see if Philip is still available because I'm not entirely certain on the answer to that. Philip, are you still there? The question is whether, I know that with a minority opportunity district, the requirement is for voting age population, but I'm not certain about the specific for DACA. Do you know?
It would not be, DACA are not citizens, so they would not be counted. They would not be counted in that.
Okay.
Okay, so so the census data actually filters that out. Or I'm not an expert in any of that stuff, but I just want to make sure when I look at voting age population and it says 50 plus 1% of a certain race, that all those people are eligible to vote.
Well, that's the key here. Let me chime in. We're not using CVAP, Citizen Voting Age Population, because that's a survey by the U.S. Census, and we don't have that, right?
Correct.
So we are just using voting age population, and the census counts people. And remember, there was a big lawsuit filed that went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. So we are counting people for purposes of the census. So when you say voting age population, that's any person over 18. We're not taking into account their citizenship, However, some cities and some entities do look at CVAP, citizen voting age population, but we don't have that data because, again, that's an American Community Survey, right? And we don't have that data right now for CVAP. We're only using VAP, which is voting age population, right?
That's my understanding, yes.
Yeah, so DACA, anyone over 18 that's Hispanic or African-American or Anglo is included in voting age population, whether they're citizens or not. If we had another measure called CVAP, citizen voting age population, then that would not include DACA because DACA are not citizens. Just to be clear, DACA stands for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. It was done by executive order first by President Obama. It was extended. President Trump tried to revoke it. Then there was litigation. And so those folks can work, but it does not confer any special status other than they cannot be deported. So that's what DACA is, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. Yes, Mr. Schur.
Could you speak in your mic so they could hear you?
Yeah, just to be clear, you could have a 50 or even a 60% voting age population, and yet it might only constitute about 40% of those people might be eligible to vote.
Plausibly, sure. Yes, that's likely.
And are those reasonable kinds of numbers? I mean, is there any benchmark or number that you could throw out as?
I would not dare to throw out a number because that's, especially to keep it specific to Fort Worth, I don't have that data in front of me.
So it would depend upon a particular neighborhood and who happens, socioeconomic base.
Yeah, I think it's going to be hard once you start with voting age population to figure out of the voting age population, especially let's say any community has a large number of immigrants, how many of that adult voting age population are citizens, legal permanent residents, DACA, and then how much of those are undocumented? It'd be hard to get all that data.
Yeah, that was my point in talking about the mixed status situation because it is so heterogeneous, but it's difficult to pin down and to measure. That was why I cautioned against doing something like that.
I mean, I can say this, in Fort Worth, the previous voting history has shown that only District 2, which traditionally has had anywhere from 60 to 70% Hispanic voting age population, is the only district ever elected a Hispanic, whereas District 9 in the south side that has a 50% Hispanic voting age population has never elected a Hispanic. And again, we can look at the boundaries of district. And I have my theory. I'll be happy to share that with you when we get into the maps as to why that is the case in Council District 9. Because there is, if anything, I mean, we've come a long way in the United States, but we still have racially polarized voting. I mean, there is no other way around it. We still have that. That's why there's still lawsuits filed all the time when registering happens at the state level. And that's why we have the Voting Rights Act, even though the Supreme Court several years ago did away with what they call preclearance. Used to, whatever maps we submitted, since we were one of the covered entities, we'd have to submit our maps for preclearance with the U.S. Justice Department. The Supreme Court said we had come a long way since then, and we didn't need to do that anymore. And that's open for debate. But anyway, that's where we find ourselves.
I do have a question as well.
Mr. Hermosillo.
For the professor. So you mentioned that what some research has shown, and I understand predominantly at the national level, is that when a minority opportunity district is created, there tends to be what I understood is a short-term negative effect within the Latino community that's now that, the minority in that newly created minority opportunity district. So is it your understanding that it is just sort of a longer runway for that community to sort of, because of socioeconomic challenges and, other related factors that maybe enables them to be able to, one, have people that are financially able to be qualified to run, and then sort of rally around that, to therefore then get a minority candidate actually elected and into office?
Yeah, so it is, and it is so nuanced and so varied, and it depends on the context, which is why I wanted to put out there that in our context here, it is a dynamic context in the sense that we have a sort of a long historical presence of Latinos and also strong demographic growth of Latinos. And so in that context, you would expect that sort of runway to shorten, right? So compared to a different context in which it's just an emerging sort of an emerging state or municipality that doesn't have a lot of sort of infrastructure. So organizations that don't have the organizational capacity to mobilize and educate Latinos about voting, especially newly naturalized Latinos. So a lot of the attention tends to go to sort of younger people sort of joining the electorate. But for Latinos, oftentimes, and it again depends on the context, but oftentimes you have more new citizens are outnumbering people that are turning 18 in terms of those who are joining the electorate. Again, depends on the context. And I wanted to say that yes, in the short term, it can suppress participation, but when you have additional layers, so I cited the other study that I cited says when you have layers of representation, then that's what really matters more to boosting participation.
And thank you. And so then you mentioned that in the, maybe with lower income Latino communities, that there tends to be greater opportunity for political engagement through ways that better relate to them. So you talked about cultural identity, for example, and so seems here that maybe more efforts of outreach in Spanish, like truly in Spanish, would be more effective here. I mean, where we have just predominantly Spanish-speaking communities versus your middle income and up Latino households.
Yeah. And so that again depends, right? So what you're making a very important point. Something I had in the presentation as well, but I didn't emphasize it enough. But even advertising, even get out the vote in Spanish, the research has shown that does a great job at mobilizing new citizens, right?
Call us out of recess, back into our public meeting on redistricting. And now comes the tough part, right? The actual rankings that we provided, as well as narrowing down from the 26 maps that we looked at. Just before we begin, I do want to provide a bit of historical context, right? Since 1977, Fort Worth has been at 8-1.
Might be a wash, right?
After 1980 census,
voters that you're turning
Fort Worth
off,
stayed at 8-1.
you're doing all
After
this advertising in
1990,
Spanish to try to
Fort
get
Worth stayed at
low
8-1. I think by
propensity
1994, its population was over
It's really
535,000. After 2000.
Thank you for your time.
I appreciate the question. Thank you.
Fort Worth stayed
Any other questions?
At 8-1.
All right. Thank you so much.
When Fort Worth's population was in the 740,000.
Do the task force wish to continue or take a quick 5-minute break so we can stretch as we head into the nitty gritty? You want to continue? Or you want to take a 5-minute break?
And then, so now.
5 minutes, let's take 5 minutes.
20 census, we're going to go to 10-1 because there was a charter election.
We'll recess for 5 minutes.
In 2016, where 10-1 passed by one of the narrowest of margins. And that same charter amendment election, council pay was defeated, staggered terms were defeated. Well, I don't know if they were put on the ballot, but longer terms were defeated. So here we are, and we're going to go to 10-1 for the first time ever. And then throughout that time, historically, 2 districts have elected African Americans, districts 5 and 8. 5 is currently represented by Councilmember Gina Bivens. District 8 is currently represented by Councilmember Chris Nettles. And then the only districts ever elected Hispanic was District 2 from 77-91, Louis Zapata, but then from 91 to 2003, Jim Lane, then from 2005, 93 to 2005, Jim Lane, 2005 to 2017, yours truly, Sal Espino, and then since 2017, the President Carlos Flores. Now, District 9, on paper, has looked like a Hispanic opportunity district with a 50% Hispanic population, but it has never elected a Hispanic member of this council. And each time a Hispanic candidate has run in that district, they have lost. So that's where we are today. And again, while we've talked a lot about Latino opportunity districts, the African American community has done a wonderful job in getting organized and voting. And so for the first time in the history of Fort Worth, there are 3 African American members on council, in addition to Councilmember Gina Bivens in District 5, Councilmember Chris Knowles in 8. This past election cycle, Councilmember Jared Williams was elected in Council District 6. So the Fort Worth City Council has gotten more diverse and younger, and also newer. There are I think 5 new council members, right? So it's a more diverse and younger council than ever before. So with that, Fernando, I'll turn it over to you to talk about where we go next.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members of the task force. at the beginning of our meeting, our chair reminded us that your principal task today is to take the list of 26 maps and reduce it to 5 for the purposes of conducting more research by our outside legal counsel and by our political science expert on the extent to which those 5 maps comply with the law and serve to create minority opportunity districts, which is, of course, one of the high priority criteria that this task force recommended and the city council has adopted. We hope you found it beneficial to receive a briefing on the creation of minority opportunity districts. I think it's plain from what we heard this afternoon that the creation of minority opportunity districts is more of an art than a science. The law and the political science are both complex and nuanced and don't lend themselves to simple formulas. And that will make your task that much more challenging than it meets the eye. I think you've all come to a full appreciation of that fact by virtue of the exercise that we've taken to ask each of you individually to identify and rank your top 5 maps. You've done that actually twice. The first time back in November, early December, and then subsequently we did a restart after the city council reset the rules, allowed certain maps to be included, and reopened the window within which residents could submit additional maps, hence a total of 26 maps, 3 of which, of course, have now been withdrawn. So in effect, you have 23 maps from which to select 5 for further research. We'd like to set the stage for your discussion by reminding you, and equally important, reminding the public that's viewing this meeting about the process that we followed to date, the next steps that we'll be taking toward adoption by the City Council of the 10-district map that Chairman Espino described for us. And then finally, we'd like to summarize the results of your informal straw poll on the top 5 maps. So, just by way of reminder, the City Council on December 14th, the last council meeting in 2021, adopted a resolution accepting the staff proposed maps that had been the subject of so much discussion and to reopen that opportunity for residents to propose maps. The council extended that deadline for submission of maps to December 17th at 5 o'clock. That's significant because we actually received maps after 5 o'clock on December 17th, which we were not able to accept. We then asked the staff provided a set of the proposed maps and corresponding data tables to you and asked you to identify and rank your top 5 maps for each member of the task force. See if I can go back. Thank you. We need to put full screen if you can. Thank you. Okay, and so today we're asking you to select to reach consensus on your top 5 maps for the task force for further review. You will then have a public hearing. Those 5 maps are just for further review. That does not disqualify any of the other maps, but it does signal that you are focusing on those 5 maps as those most warranting further consideration. But you're not formally disqualifying the other maps. You're then conducting a public hearing next Thursday at 6 o'clock in the council chamber, at which individual residents will be able to speak for 3 minutes each about any of the maps under consideration. You will then be able to take that information fully into account when you meet again on Monday, January 24th. That's your last scheduled task force meeting, at which time you're to select the initial map for submission to the council at the following city council work session. As we discussed at your first meeting, since the resolution charging the task force with certain responsibilities does not preclude the modification of any of the proposed maps, you may feel free to make minor adjustments to the preferred map in order to produce the map that you want to recommend. However, our legal counsel will remind us that those are to be minor adjustments because you have been instructed to select a map, not to produce a map from scratch. So if you wanted to tweak your preferred map in a relatively minor way, I think there would be no reason to prohibit that. But we would remind you to be careful not to make substantial changes to any of the maps, because that would lie outside of the charge given to you by the city council. And then on Tuesday, February 1st, your chair would, on your behalf, would present that initial map to the city council at a work session. We would encourage all of you, or as many of you as are able to do so conveniently, to attend that council work session as a show of support for your chair. The council then, having received that initial map from the task force, would then conduct a public hearing before considering any changes to that initial map. Now, all of these procedures are set forth in a previously adopted council resolution. That would be on February 8th. On the 15th, they would have a special work session to consider changes to the initial map and produce a proposed map, a council proposed map. Now, they are to begin with your initial map, and they are to make changes that they wish to make to that initial map and to justify, explain each change that they make. That is part of the resolutions the council adopted. So presumably they would not create a whole new map. They would begin with your initial map and adjust it as they see fit, with an explanation for each adjustment that they make. Then they would take that proposed map and take it out into the community for a series of 4 public hearings in each pair of adjacent existing districts across Fort Worth. The exact locations of those hearings have not yet been set, but we expect to be able to announce them soon. After those public hearings, the council would have a second special work session on March 22nd, during which they would produce a final map subject to adoption formally at their council meeting on March 29th. So by the end of March, the council should be able to adopt a map that will go into effect with the May 2023 election. So as you proceed with the task of selecting your top 5 maps, we'd like to remind you of your aggregate scores. Each task force member was given the opportunity to identify as many as 5 maps. Not all task force members identified 5, but that's fine. We assigned 5 points to your number 1 map, 4 points to number 2, 3 points to number 3, 2 points to your number 4 map, and 1 point to your number 5 map. And you can see that a half dozen or so of the maps received no votes. 3 of the maps, including map W, which isn't shown here, but map W today was withdrawn by the author. So you can see that that maps H, K, and now W have been withdrawn, leaving 23 maps. And there are actually 6 maps receiving 10 points or more, with the 5th and 6th tying for the 5th place. And so the highest scoring map is map X. You heard some of our speakers earlier this afternoon speaking in favor of map X, largely on the basis of the way it creates minority opportunity districts. So X received 25 points. You can see that the next highest scoring map is map S, which is quite different from X. The map S received 17 points. You see that map Q, which was the most popular map in the first round of the first straw poll, map Q still received 14 points. Then you have map U, which was favored by some of the same folks who favored Q. Map U received 12 points. Then finally, maps I and Z each received 11 points. I think you'll find that different task force members emphasized different criteria. That's perfectly natural and to be expected. And that I believe that sets the stage for our discussion. Mr. Chairman, there are many different ways to go about it, but one way to do it would be to go around the table and give each task force members a brief opportunity to explain why they assigned the rankings that they did, and begin to identify some common themes among the task force members to serve as a starting point for discussion.
Well, let me just say one thing before I go to Mr. Kennedy. There's 6, right? We needed to narrow it down to 5, and there's a tie for 5th place.
At this time, yes.
At this time. Now, we may change, but one suggestion, if we can't narrow it down to 5, if we're tied on 5 and 6, is just submit 6 maps.
There's nothing wrong with that. But no legal reason why you couldn't submit 6.
All right. Ms. Kennedy.
When Dr. Paul Wilson was speaking, he mentioned that Q and U were both submitted by him. Q was his first submission, and that U was a update to Q.
I believe Q was actually submitted by a staff member.
Okay, maybe I wrote that down wrong.
But U is based on Q.
And then there was a talk of a modified S. Was that submitted, or is that changes they would like to see to S? That was submitted?
Michelle, do you want to come up and respond?
I'm just looking at the notes here.
This is Michelle Swindle from our IT department.
I thought I had the lookup. So Dr. Wilson's is U. Okay. That is based off of Q. Okay. And the other one that he submitted
is Y is the
S1.
Okay. So Y is the S1.
Okay, Y is okay.
Modified S is map V, I believe.
Map V? What? Map what?
U and V, correct. V is the modified.
V like in victory.
Oh, V like
is
victory.
The modified S one.
Okay.
That is correct.
All right, so V is modified S. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. And then if I recall, they were in favor of V and U, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Correct.
All right. Those were the two that he. All right, I got it. Just want to clarify that. Yes, Mr. Bradshaw.
So, Fernando, you had mentioned deadlines. So this request coming in for a new community of interest, number 78. I mean, at that point, you know, we had deadlines for everything else.
Yes, sir. I would say two things. First of all, I don't think there's any reason why you couldn't consider what they have given to you. On the other hand, in fairness to everybody who's participated in this entire process, we did set a deadline. I believe it was back in September for interested organizations to register as communities of interest. And we set a hard deadline, and that was the basis upon which everybody drew maps. to introduce a new set of communities of interest at this point would be to change the rules after the game has been played. On the other hand, that's not to say that as you evaluate all of these maps, you can't think about how an unofficial community of interest, one that's just been proposed, might be affected by these maps. So there's no reason why you couldn't consider that.
Yeah, so we have the latitude to make adjustments, right?
Yes, sir.
So I mean, to me, it's like, I think it's too late to say this is now a community of interest.
Yes, sir.
However,
Yes.
you know, after the fact, we can say, let's take a look, given they
Yes.
asked us to, we can take a look and see if we can make an accommodation.
Yes, sir.
If that's,
I think that's fair enough.
okay.
And I will say that these are neighborhood associations all coming together, so we can also consider how the different neighborhood associations collectively come together as a community of interest, right? I mean, even if
Yes.
they're not registered, obviously, common sense tells you if it's a community of interest or not.
Yes.
In my book, they are a community of interest, but again, the task force has the right to recognize that, but that's the way I see it, but.
Yes, sir. That's perfectly reasonable.
All right.
I had a couple other questions.
Yes, go ahead, Mr. Bradshaw. I didn't mean to interrupt your.
No, you didn't. So one, I think Mr. Miller said that the software that the citizens used, ESRI, did not show them when they were breaking up community of interest. Is that correct? I mean, I just wanted to verify if that was true or not.
Wow.
That is correct.
There was no indication when they were splitting those communities of interest. The software didn't allow for a flag to notify that because that is a Fort Worth Task Force specific criteria. It's not a software criteria. So there's some that are general that apply to all different groups who use the software. So the vendor specifically writes that into the code to their validation criteria. And since this is one that's only specific to us, it's a new geography that we defined in-house, they couldn't apply that.
Okay.
That makes sense.
So the maps that staff provided before we knew that it was staff, they were aware of that?
So
The communities of interest then, right?
everyone was aware of the communities of interest. That information was published as a map itself, in addition to being in the software. There's just not a visual check of this is cutting or this is not. You have to go look for it. So if you know that you want to keep the community of interest, during the training I showed that you can select communities of interest and you can assign them to specific geographies. So you say you're taking, I can't think of a community of interest at the moment. You're taking this neighborhood and you're wanting to assign this entire neighborhood. There's steps that you can do that, or you can freehand it. So we didn't want to limit people and say it has to be done this way, because there are reasons that people did divide communities of interest, because some of those geographies are a little cattywampus. So they're following 30, and so they cut a very big community of interest. So I hope that answered your question.
And just a couple more. One, Bert Williams, because of the death of his wife.
Yes.
Is he, at this point, going to be joining us again? Do we know?
I think he will,
Okay.
but his wife recently passed, and he's not been able to participate fully.
So I didn't know if, at some point, if he wanted to submit his scores, his ranking, at what point should we?
I think you need to make a decision today as to what your top 5 are.
Okay. And then the final thing is just advertising for the council meeting on the 13th. I mean, is the city making a pretty big effort to make sure that we get, a lot of public comment?
Yes, we're getting the word out through our communications department, and in fact, the city manager announced it at the city council work session earlier this week.
Okay, so I want to make sure we're there as long as possible.
Yes, no doubt.
Public input is always welcome.
And we've also reached out to the authors of all these maps and reminded them about the public hearing and encouraged them to come and present the rationale behind each map at their discretion.
So, task force members, you heard Mr. Costa's recommendation. I mean, if you look at that, you already see pretty clearly 6 maps. I'm happy to hear from everybody on this task force as to why they ranked them the way they did. So if that's, if you can elaborate very briefly, because we have, what, 10, 1, 2, 3, 4. We'll be here as long as you want, but, we want to be transparent. We want to be efficient. We want to obviously continue to provide this process. So I think I like what Fernando's saying. So Mr. Bradshaw, do you want to go first and tell us why you ranked them the way you did, or should I go off the chart? Espino, Williams? I'm the chair. I should go last, right? I don't. So I guess we'll go off the way we have it there. Espino, Williams, Mr. Schur. Why don't you go first and explain how you came up with your rankings?
Well, I spent an extensive amount of time with spreadsheets, taking the data and trying to distill it into various, into various meaningful categories and sorting it. And I checked all the communities of interest that were divided to see, and I have provided a chart of that. That was very important to me, that certain communities of interest not be divided. And then I started looking at the demographics, because I think we met all the other particular tests. I think none of the other tests at this point are really in dispute. All of these maps satisfy them, unless you were to say that you had to, to have a specific percentage of communities of interest being undivided. So I looked at those demographics, and it was very striking. I mean, and you can see in the handout that is prepared, it's called Why Maps X, Y, and Z Deserve Top Ratings. I have put in a specific chart for every single map of our top 6. And as you compare them, you can see that in some of these charts, there may be 2 Hispanic majorities. This is like maps Q and U. That would be page 9 of my handout. If you look at those, you have a 50.8% Hispanic majority paired with 31.7 African American. And I think we know from experience that that is the kind of a situation that would be extraordinarily discouraging to Hispanics. Ever since single-member districts have existed in Fort Worth, as Mr. Flores has told us, at how many meetings has he told us this? The south side of Fort Worth with large Hispanic populations has never been able to elect anyone. And with this division, it would not fare any better. And so for that portion of maps Q and U, I just basically thought they're not worthy of consideration for that, at least that part of it. And I think I'm willing to consider that maybe we could take pieces of the different maps and put them together and construct one that would satisfy, the north side folks, and then the south side folks, and the southwest side folks. It may be possible, I don't know, but I want to go to maps, the ones that I did like, which were maps X, Z, and I. And what you note with map X, if you look at page 6, is that the Hispanic voting age populations, where there are good concentrations of Hispanic voting age concentrations, they're not paired against African American populations. These maps, every one of them, the Hispanics they've got good Hispanic voting age populations, but they're not paired against the African American populations, with the one exception of map I, which in District 8 pairs 50.5% Hispanic with 34.5 African American. And again, that's the same situation that we talked about before. So I had strong preferences for maps X and Z with Y being my really it was one of my picks. But that is why I chose the ones that I did. And I think that the jagged boundaries on compactness are totally insignificant given the way the west side of Fort Worth is designed. So what I would like to see is I would like to see us, see if, we heard Mr. Calderon said, I will make adjustments to my map. I'm ready to make some. I think if we were to have him, say, if we said, can you address Dr. Wilson's desires? I think he probably could do it. If we get down to the issues on the southwest side, well, southwest impacts south. So that might be a tougher thing to do. But I think that we need to find some way of making it possible for these things to happen. So that's my thought.
Thank you, Mr. Schur. I'll keep going, and then at the end, we'll open it up for further debate and discussion. Mr. Norris, I'm just going up there, going from left to right. I'm waiting. Mr. Women's not here, and I'll be last. Mr. Norris.
Thank you. Yes, well, I'm going to make it even more complicated. I feel like based on some of the presentations today and some of the analysis that Mr. Schur did, it was helpful for me to go back through, and so I think I would answer it differently as we sit here right now than is on here. So that kind of makes things more complicated. So I don't know that I'm advocating for a particular a section. My methodology, though, was just kind of my area of town, which is kind of southwest side of Fort Worth, is what I know the best. And so looking at that district and kind of the shape of it in the communities and neighborhoods that I know, and then kind of taking that, so the maps that kind of meet that, and then also looking at the minority opportunity districts and the opportunity to try and create a greater level of diversity potentially. And so it was very helpful to have, just in a really succinct way, to have these broken down, and helpful too to look at the competing districts that I had not thought of it in that context before, and I think that is really important. And so so all that to say, I mean, I can list out the ones kind of as I would say now, but I've come on board with V probably as my first choice, and then in descending order M, S, Y, and then X is kind of where I am right now.
All right. Let's continue, and we'll come back for discussion. I guess, Ms. Kennedy, you're next. No, Ms. Herrera. Ms. Herrera, sorry. Got to read. That's why I have glasses.
So I approached it very much the same way that Bill did. I did not take the time to put mine into spreadsheets, but I started out by listing all the maps, and then I looked at the minority opportunity voting, the VAP percent, each one of the categories that was on the criteria sheet for that VAP percent, looked at communities of interest because that was something really important. I listened to what the speakers had said before to take that into consideration. And then I looked at compactness and then how many met the criteria that this task force, prior to me joining, actually put in place for the boundaries of, how to come up with the right maps to present to City Council. So my top, it's quite interesting. So I was surprised that I took another look at from what I originally presented, or submitted rather, to now I had made changes in my choices. So this round, still looking at it the same I did the first time, I ranked mine as you can see there. A couple of comments that I would like to make, just kind of in looking at what Bert has put together, and he submitted to us today or yesterday or today, that some of the maps are similar. So like on map Q, withdraw that perhaps and use, and rather than using Q, use U. There seems to be a lot of talk about U. The Fossil Creek and Stone Glen, even though they were late to the table in saying their community of interest, I do think it's very important to keep those communities together and not have them, especially them, isolated. So that's something that I did want to consider and want to listen to what the voice of the people have to say. Another one might be to, this might be controversial, but withdraw map I and combine it with Y. There's some similarities there. Y does better, it scores higher on some other criteria that I didn't. Maybe choose between maps X and Z, come up with one of those, and I guess probably as we decide what we want to do here, that's something that we'll ultimately do, maybe narrow that down. Perhaps withdraw map R. I'm not really sure that anybody has, that was on the lower tier. And consider map T, because that brought in Como district into District 6. So withdraw map I, because it's similar to Y, although map W was withdrawn. So just a couple of additional feedback based upon what Bert put together as some analysis, and then going back, that's how I came up with my selections for this go-around.
Okay. Let's now go to Ms. Kennedy.
Well, I want to say that I feel like I've had such a huge education over the last month, and especially just even the last few days. And like Mr. Norris, I feel like just the last couple of days, some of my options changed a bit. I especially appreciated the very lengthy email we got from Mr. Flores from the United Hispanic Association explaining what happens in District 9, because District 9 is supposed to be a Hispanic opportunity district, and how that works, that, you know, there's never been a Hispanic councilman, even though they've actually put out some very good candidates in that district. So for me, going into looking at it now, and I've said that, you know, the far north side has a huge population, has huge population growth outside of our criteria that as the initial task force put together. You know, I looked at all of those criteria. Communities of interest is really important to me, because I feel like in District 6, our community, our homeowners association works with our council people a lot on stuff. So I know how important it is that your community stays together. And so communities of interest was really a very important thing to me, especially after we've had so many through the last, what have we been doing this, a year and a half or so, so many communities of interest come and talk to us about how important that is to them. That was a very big thing to me. And then I've just spent I spent the entire Wednesday before Thanksgiving from like 6 a.m. till like 11 p.m. just going over and over and over the VAPs. My entire family, I was like, sorry family, you're on your own for cooking. And I'm the one who does the cooking, so that was fun. But really a deep dive into that, and because I really want us to represent our citizens the best we can. So all of that to say is I would really like to see us look again at especially maps like how well U does for the top half of the city, but something how X and Z do a much better job of having 5 actual minority opportunity districts, whereas some of the others say they have 4 or 5 or 6, but you have the overlap of the Hispanic and African American populations, as Mr. Ellison's spreadsheet showed us, which that was a very good. So I think if we could use something where we can, if we can get someone or some way to look at that. And then also one of the things that's important to me in District 6, we live along the Chisholm Trail Tollway, and that is a huge economic development, economic growth area, and some of the ways that people used to create the second Hispanic minority district was to kind of just do whatever with District 6. Because I think that District 6 is one of those that people we've just had a lot of growth. 20 years ago, the vast majority of District 6 was cow pastures. And so most people just don't even have any idea what's down there. So they just drew whatever. But so there are a lot of maps that have that kind of broken up, but everything along that Chisholm Shaw Parkway needs to really stay together for that economic development. And the other thing that was really important to me was looking at the population growth. There are a lot of the maps have what is now District 6 having way too much population because we're one of the districts that's the fastest growing, and we're just going to outgrow our the size of our population really fast, and not just us, but several of the other ones. I don't think a lot of them balanced out for population growth very well.
Thank you, Ms. Kennedy. And now we go to Mr. DeVito.
Thanks, sir. I will be brief because I was able to produce a summary of my map analysis for the planned December meeting, which never took place, and I was not anticipating attending that. So you pretty much had a chance. If you reviewed my summary, you know how I arrived at my conclusions. I will say that it was a very difficult task. There's a lot of very good maps submitted, and you're really getting down to some minute differences in ranking these maps, 1 to 5. They're very good maps. I would possibly, in light of some of the new information, I would probably maybe change a little bit of my ranking today, but we'll get into that here with further discussion. But basically, I'm happy with the 6 maps that have risen to the top here. I think that we'll be able to have some good quality discussion around those and come up with something positive for the council to consider. Thank you.
Ms. Powell.
One of the things I looked at as a whole was the demographics, the growth, and the social and economic levels of every district. And looking at the maps that I believe that's more suited for the city as a whole, I took into play the community of interest. A lot of community of interest want to remain one district, I believe all of the community of interest have some of the same concerns from what I've read and saw, the roads, the park, and so forth. But at the end of the day, every citizen who take the opportunity to exercise their right to vote is going to vote for whomever they choose to. And then the creating the districts, the 2 extra districts, I don't believe map X represent a strong growth, community of interest for the entire city of Fort Worth. The maps I have chosen, I am satisfied with those maps. I can say that the political scientist, gentleman, I can't remember his name right now, the Latino, okay. He shared some very strong information, some that I had already had written down in regard to the Latinos, and talking about those when he spoke about the different levels within that community culture, and looking at even District 9 population is more Hispanic, but there's never been a Hispanic representative. That's not because of the individuals who have been running for the office, that the white candidate won that seat. It's only because of the people who came out and voted. So to create 2 new districts, looking at Fossil Creek and Park Glen, I understand they want to remain the same. But after even spending time in those districts as a guest, I found that it's not beneficial for the city as well as the citizen that it remain one. We want to talk about creating minority opportunity. It's very little Hispanics as well as Blacks opportunity in those districts, even though there are citizens living there. And then me personally, I've had experience the lack of diversity of concern of community of interest within those districts. I have family members that lives all over the city of Fort Worth. And as you were speaking, Ms. Kennedy, I believe. You're right, Chisholm Trail has grown. I have several young people, that nieces and nephews, who stay out there at Millennium, and they vote. I believe as the city continues to grow, we're going to see a vast, wide of diversity in all areas of the city. But what is important, what's more important, that Foster Creek, North Side remain the same. Change is inevitable. It's certain to come. It's going to happen. With them remaining the same, is it going to be beneficial for the city as a whole, or just beneficial for them themselves? While other areas go without because of the statistics, the politics, they're able to get more funding. They're growing faster at a faster rate, economically and social, versus the other areas in the city. What would be a big issue? Why not? Why not change in Foster Creek? Why not change in Park Glen versus change in the South and the Southeast? That's something I think we should take in consideration. And again, what I've selected, the R, T, V, S, and J are I think, represent to me, after looking at all the data and looking at the city perspective as a whole for growth, not just demographically, but economically and social. I believe those represent, and that's something that we should take in consideration and look at.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Powell. Ms. Herrera?
I just want to make a comment. I appreciate your opinions, and I'm not trying to, I just want to state something. The Fossil Creek and the Park Glen, that was just to remain as a cohesive community, so it's not being split down the middle. There were some maps for heritage that I didn't consider because that would be, right now, we are a split community. So that means we have two different representatives on the city council. Fortunately for us, they've worked together in the past, and so with this opportunity to redraw the lines, that's what they're looking for. Not to say we don't want, different races. This is my opinion. I don't believe they're saying we don't want different races to come into the community. They're just wanting to be whole as a voice, and so that they have one representation at City Hall and not be split.
All right, let's keep going, and we'll continue debate after everybody speaks. Okay, Ms. Powell, you'll have, I'll say rebuttal, and then we'll go forward. Then we'll have further debate after everyone speaks. Go ahead, Ms. Powell.
Thank you for your opinion. I respect you do have the opportunity to have your opinion. But again, that it still plays as a whole, it still plays a part in the demographic as well. As I stated before, after spending time over there in those areas, I'm talking about just recent within these last 3 weeks, there is a stigma in that area. I didn't look like, personally, I didn't look like I was looking today. But just last week, because my battery my daughter's battery, her car wouldn't start because her battery was dead. She had me blocked in. So therefore, I couldn't get my granddaughter to school, who goes to Foster Ridge. Matter of fact, all her teachers are white, but Foster Ridge itself is a melting pot. It's very diverse with the students, but all the teachers are white. So I had to walk her 1.5 miles to school because she's never walked to school, okay? But in that journey in walking, I had Caucasian whites look at me strange, come up to me, even one on a moped, true story, asking me, do I know where the post office is? I had others who, one particular lady asked me, did I see a crazy man in a Jeep? But she's walking her dog. Really? So again, with what you're saying, as a whole, you still want what you want, but at the same time, you still have a stigma, and it's not healthy for the city as a whole. And it still doesn't create a minority. It don't create a minority, Black or Asian or Hispanic opportunity of vote, to run for office, because the majority is white. But at the same time, you want to remain whole. One gentleman, he got up at the podium and spoke about endangerment. What's endangerment? It's in danger all over the city of Fort Worth.
I'm sorry you had to go through that, Ms. Powell. And I see what you're saying, and we all have a very difficult job here because we got to balance the legal requirements, the fair and equitable requirements, and I'm sorry that you went through that. And again, we do respect your views, we respect Ms. Herrera's views, and we respect the views of the Fossil Creek Park Glen folks. And having to go from 26 to 23 down to 5 maps it's going to be difficult, but here we are. So we'll continue debate, and now I'll go to Mr. Bradshaw for his analysis of the maps.
Yeah, so I think that the first thing is we've got two new districts, right? We need to determine how to allocate those. I understand that people talk about population growth, and we're estimating that we're going to have growth on the southwest side, and clearly the north side, or not the north side, but the far north is where most of the growth is going to happen. I don't think that we cannot create a new district up there, it would be, well, I mean, we wouldn't be able to make the math work, right, if we didn't create another district up there. Community of interest was another high priority. So anything that went above 20% of, breaking up communities of interest, the way I look at that is that is, the neighborhoods stepped forward and said, we want to remain together, right? And I think that's a very strong indication that we need to respect the interest of the majority of our citizens. And if we can draw a fair map, right, that anticipates the future, that keeps communities together. And the third criteria that comes in is really the fact that we do not have another Hispanic minority opportunity district. And I think that is an overriding concern. And so that was really the third criteria. Once they cleared the first two hurdles in terms of, population, and that's really creating another district up north, keeping communities of interest together, and then third was to see if we could create the best Hispanic minority opportunity district, which I think is X. I did not vote for Z, which is very similar because I didn't think I wanted to put my vote on the one I thought the very best, and then I looked at some other criteria in terms of like O was my second choice, and that really kind of reflected our first go around. That one actually has the most, the highest number of minority districts with minority greater than 50%. It also had a good COI, community of interest, was pretty low in terms of breaking those up. But when I looked at it, it didn't meet the Hispanic, a good Hispanic opportunity district. So really right now, I think X is, I think far and away with my top three criteria is the one that I'm focusing on. And if we can take into account some of the other, issues, and then finally, between X and Z, the issue really actually comes down to where I live in my district. In Z, they take a very, I would say, if you look at the letter from Mr. Is it Calderon? No, is it Flores? Excuse me. He talks about that election and how it broke down between 8th Avenue and things that are north of Berry and all that. So if you look at the difference between X and Z, Z puts in a very kind of fair amount, which is really transitioned in the past 25 years, is much more like stuff that is west of 8th Avenue. And so X takes that and puts it into that district, which I would say reflects more of a similar population and demographic, and then carves out the rest and puts in the Hemphill corridor and everything into the new Hispanic minority opportunity district. And that's why I chose X over Z. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Bradshaw. Ms. Hermosillo?
Okay. Well, I guess to be really brief, Mr. Schur did me the favor of providing a handy PowerPoint presentation that really well articulates and creates a visual for the rest of my fellow task force members here as to the basis for the criteria that I prioritized in ranking what are still my top three, which is Map X, Map Z, and Map I. In particular, on page 5 of his PowerPoint, my primary points of concern as it relates to population growth, projected growth of the, projected demographic growth of the different races. It seems just inevitable and sort of long overdue that the final map creates a second Hispanic opportunity district while preserving the strength of the one in the north side. Therefore, when you look at projected growth and current growth estimates, one in the south side is what makes the most sense. And I would be remiss in analyzing that without also having taken into account, as demonstrated here, what which of these proposed maps also did not compromise or threaten in any way the African American VAP percentages in some of the in the other existing maps. Looking at also this handy dandy color coded chart that we received just a few minutes ago from another speaker today, and which I had not seen until this meeting. Again, focusing on my top 3 ranked maps, X, and I'll look at X and Z specifically right now. You see, again, the strength of preserving modified District 2, creating another Hispanic Opportunity District in the South Side, and then it reflects 3 African-American districts that have in excess of 30% or and higher of the voting age population percentages. That was kind of a recurring number that came up, and when I also compared that relative to who sits in elected office today in our city council, it felt like a safe way to proceed in taking into account the African American population across the city. Let's see, any further comments? I mean, really, it's just sort of best articulated in those slides. And I think after hearing some other comments from my fellow task force members, you know, I hope that there's the possibility of creating additional adjustments to, say, District 6, for example, and some of the north side communities of interest. And I guess to be clear, when I think of communities of interest, I think of the example that Mr. Bradshaw just ended with, talking about District 9. There's really very little in common with Hemp Hill and Worth Heights neighborhoods in Berkeley and the Fairmount that exists today versus the Fairmount that I grew up with, actually. And so, but I'm hopeful that I think a variation or tweaks on perhaps X or Z, or possibly I, again, my third one, and there's strong factors I think that merit further consideration of that. I'm hopeful that there can be tweaks to some of those other, again, 6, 7, and again, the new proposed far north side district that would reflect and further capture some of the concerns that have already been cited. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hermosillo. Ms. Boyd?
So when I was looking at the maps, I considered all the communities of interest. One of my challenges with the communities of interest is still, I think there's so many other factors that go into like even forming a community of interest and going through that process. Even this whole thing of redistricting, like we all said, it's very complicated. So considering disenfranchised voters and communities have historically been marginalized in ways that they haven't been represented on council is something that I tried to strongly consider, even within looking at communities of interest. And there were some maps that split up or moved some of the communities of interest into other districts that didn't favor like what they maybe submitted or that they discussed that was a priority for them. So trying to consider that. Also the opportunity districts and thinking about the future of Fort Worth and thinking about it from an equity mindset and from not just this task force, but the Race and Culture Task Force and all the things that we've been hearing and considering. I know I live in District 6 too, and I know right now we have representation from a Black man, but that's not something that is just a guarantee. And that was a battle to get to that seat. So I think even considering that, like what some of the numbers may look like, it doesn't, like people have said in non and other areas, doesn't mean that it'll actualize into that. So those are a lot of the things that I tried to consider as I looked at the maps. And I have X and Z, and even as other people have said, considering a lot of the conversations. And I'm hopeful that for next week too, that we can have an even more diverse or a more diverse group of people from the public to come. I know it'll be in the evening. I think that has a lot of factors too of people who can maybe come here today, but I hope that we can consider those things too. And thinking about maybe voices that we haven't heard from, how do we do an extra push to try and hear from some of those voices?
Thank you, Ms. Boyd. So my analysis, obviously, I was aware of the tremendous growth in the Fort Worth, obviously the explosion in the far north, north of 820, and of course, the explosion that's happening both far west and along the Chisholm Trail Parkway, as well as the increasing diversity of the city. And then trying to obviously follow the criteria that we had set out before. And of course, the recognition that there was a need to, in my opinion, to create a second Latina opportunity district. Because we're going from 8-1 to 10-1, and we can't figure out how to create a second one. I will say shame on us, right? And I do think when 10-1 was approved by the voters in 2016, I think the thinking was that by going to 10-1, we would have more diversity on the council, right? And of course, getting elected is a function of many factors. You got to have good candidates, right? You got to have good candidates, and then you got to have voter turnout. And as the professor pointed out, the most effective voter turnout across all demographic groups is knocking on doors. Believe me, I know from personal experience, if your feet are not tired and you have not run away from dogs that are trying to bite you as you're knocking on doors, then you haven't really campaigned. So with that, I did go with these, I went with I. I'm kind of like the outlier on I, because that created the most diverse districts. That's why I picked I. And then, I went with, what's the next one? E, because that was my first round when I did that. Then when the new maps came in, I just went with my first instincts, and I said, of the new maps that came in, which ones do I like? And I liked X and Z. And I didn't go for a fifth because I just couldn't come to grips with a fifth choice. So that's why I didn't submit a fifth choice. And so I stand by the rankings there, but, it looks like, in looking at these rankings here, I mean, we've got 6 maps. And when I finish talking, we'll see about the next steps here on how we want to go out to the public with these rankings and letting the public weigh in. And who knows, they may have some excellent suggestions. I think Ms. Kennedy thinks that we could, and I agree with her. Could you take the best of, like, let's say map X, and what's the other one, map U, or what was that, the map that you suggested? Could you do something and try to balance the need for diversity with the need to recognize growth in our city? So that's kind of and I do respectfully disagree and say that the Hispanic community is throughout the city, but there are heavy pockets of Hispanic population that you create a second strong Latino opportunity district. But at the same time, I'm cognizant of that we have always had 2 strong African American, or I should say 2 districts that have elected African Americans, districts 5 and 8. And we don't want to dilute the opportunity of the African-American community to select candidates' choice. And then as Ms. Boyd pointed out, District 6 is a very unique district because it's actually one of the most diverse districts in the city. And, I would even say, I don't know if you could call it a coalition district, but it's very diverse. And, and so a lot to weigh on. But I stand by my choices. And then now I'm going to get Fernando up there and see where we go from here after all of our input. Ms. Herrera, I did want a clarification. Do you stand by your initial choices, or do you want to make any changes just in case we have to do some tallying?
I still stand by the same ones.
Okay. All right, Mr. Costa, if you want to come up here and kind of lead us here in a discussion about, there were some pretty strong numbers there for X, 25 points, and I think that's one that should go out to the public. But again, the task force, how do we go about narrowing it down? I mean, it looks like the points speak for themselves.
The points speak for themselves. The only task force member whom we recorded as having changed their rankings is Mr. Norris. He is now ranking them V, M, S, Y, and X. And if you adjust the numbers accordingly, it makes some minor changes, but does not change the ranking of the top 6. So X goes down from 25 to 24 points. But it's still the number 1 ranked map. Number 2 is still map S, even though it goes from 17 down to 15 points. It's still the number 2 ranked map. Number 3 is still Q at 14 points. Number 4 is still U at 12 points. And there's still a tie for 5th place with map I and map Z at 11 points. And so what I would suggest, Mr. Chairman, is that we ask our outside legal counsel and our political science expert to research all 6 of those maps, unless you want to make a choice between I and Z. There's no reason you have to do that. We can go with all 6 and ask for further research on all 6. And if it's possible for them to give us their findings before the public hearing next Thursday, that would be beneficial. Obviously, we have to know before your final meeting on the 24th, as far in advance as possible, so you can give it due consideration. Leann Guzman from our law department will follow up with them and see how promptly they can provide that research for us. So I would suggest, Mr. Chairman, that we proceed with those 6, but that you take a motion to confirm that consensus.
Open up for discussion. Mr. DeVito, then I'm going to come to Ms. Boyd, then I'll go to Ms. Powell. Mr. DeVito, and then I'll go to Mr. Bradshaw.
Thank you, Sal. I think we might be able to simplify it a little bit. I love the work you're doing. I love your input, but I think I is dead on arrival. And the reason for that is that it splits Heritage into 2 districts. In fact, the top input that I received from my District 7 associations was, please do not split any associations. And as you've already heard, Heritage is already split, and they really don't want to be split again. I suspect even if we did somehow recommend I to the council, that members Moon and Firestone would stand up and say, hey, I can't do this, because they've gotten the same input from their constituents. And a reasonable council would say, you're absolutely right, we can't do that. So again, nothing insulting in what I'm saying to you. I appreciate all of the work that you're doing, but I think I is basically not worth considering.
Right. Yeah, and then who did I go next to? I think I was going to go to Ms. Powell or Ms. Boyd? Ms. Powell, then Ms. Boyd, then Mr. Bradshaw, then Mr. Herrera. Ms. Powell, do you want to say? Okay, Ms. Boyd then. I'm sorry, I thought I saw your hand. I love your glasses, by the way. I wish I was as stylish as you.
I want to make sure that the ranking doesn't matter. As far as after we come up with the 6, does the ranking matter at that point? Because
the ranking does not matter at this point.
Well, if it helps at all, I don't know if it helps or complicates it. I can move my S. I really don't. I want, like, you can actually flip my 1 and 5, where the points are. I don't know if it'll help us.
Well, what I would say on I is just go out to the public and make that objection public, and then you can cut it out when we come.
No, I'm sorry. I'm saying 1 and 5. Like my votes for, I would switch what I have for S down to Z, and you can just put the 1 wherever.
They're the rankings.
So if I'm looking under Boyd, if we give Z 5 points and we give S only 1, that reduces S down to 11 points, and that boosts Z up to 15. So that makes Z the number 2 ranked map. But again, the rankings don't matter at this stage. Right. All we're asking you to do is identify the top 5 or 6, irrespective of the order. We'll research all of them. The ranking is not consequential. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I also wanted to say something that I noticed, and I know people didn't vote for, just thinking about thinking about Como. They moved theirs, and they produced that map, their neighborhood association, moving them into District 6 in hopes of having representation, because they talked about how, and currently in District 3, it's very hard to actually elect someone from Como. So thinking about that, too, is a community of interest.
All right. I think I was going to go to Mr. Bradshaw, then Mr. Herrera. So, Mr. Bradshaw.
So I'm going to follow Mr. DeVito and pile on I.
Mm-hmm.
So the problem is the community of interest is the first thing, is at 28.9. So like we're almost at 30% breaking up community of interest. And then one of the strongest COIs that spoke to us was the Riverside Alliance.
Right.
And that also got split.
Right.
And I just, from those 2 criteria, I was like, I didn't even consider. I liked the map overall, but with those 2 things,
right,
killed it.
I hear you. And then what I would say again on that, just go out to I would say leave it in there, let the public weigh in, and the author, I maybe can tweak it based on your objections. And maybe they maybe they can present some tweaks that we can consider when we come back, understanding that map, when it comes back, may not be the one this committee picks, or this task force picks. Yeah. So, I would say just go out, everybody can object to that. The folks that are objections to that map can say what their objections are, like you said, the community of interest score, the heritage, Riverside. And as you said, some communities of interest are currently split. And again, we want to accommodate as many as we can. Map making is an art, and sometimes communities get split. I'm not saying that's going to happen again, but inevitably in redistricting, as the state of Texas has shown, you can split communities of interest, and then they end up, in legal issues for a number of reasons. But Ms. Herrera, your turn.
Actually, it's what Mr. Bradshaw said. That was one of the biggest criteria was community of interest, and then trying to make sure that Riverside was whole. So for that, I would not be in favor of the way the map's drawn now.
I hear you. So I hear everyone's concerns about high. I would just say that let's just leave it in there and let the public object to it on their grounds, and let the map maker know what the objections are and maybe suggest tweaks to us. I will say this, Riverside is the reason I think Riverside was split before is because it's a very diverse area. Prior to 2010, it was in a lot of Riverside was in District 2, but then the United Riverside neighborhood on the other side of 121 has always been in District 8 because that was a historic African-American community. So it made sense to put that both geographically and demographically in District 8. And then Riverside has changed and evolved demographically. It's a predominantly Hispanic majority population in zip code 76111, with the exception being the neighborhood of Oakhurst, which is majority Anglo, but then you look at Sylvan Heights West, you look at Scenic Bluff, you look at other neighborhoods, but it is very diverse. So I hear that, and that's a valid concern, and let's just take the maps to the public and hear their objections. Yes, Mr. Hermosillo, and I'll come back to you, Mr. DeVito.
So I just want to echo some of your comments, Sal, about Map I, and really because if this task force is ultimately really concerned with prioritizing a second Hispanic Opportunity District, there's only 3 maps that have some support from more than 1 or 2 task force members here that actually present a scenario that would allow for that to become a reality, coupled with that also does not compromise or threaten the existing African-American districts, with the understanding that, for example, District 6 is, that's not, I think it's too soon to call it one way or the other. I'm just simply looking at the data. So I just want that on the record. Yes, we hope for strong attendance at next week's meeting, but those are the only 3, and to be clear, Maps X, Maps Z, and Map I that actually present, I think, a really strong reality for creating a new Hispanic Opportunity District. Thank you.
Mr. DeVito.
I'm concerned about something. If you go to the author of Map I and say, for this map to be considered, you have to change this, you have to tweak that in some way, aren't you really opening it then up to a new map submission?
I'm saying tweaks, recommendations to the task force. I'm not saying a wholesale map. If the concern is you split these communities, is there a way to tweak that map to comply with the concerns of the task force? I'm not saying a whole new map.
But then
tweaks.
it becomes a new map, though.
Well, we have the right to tweak a map, and it becomes a new map. Let's say you like some of the features in X and some of the features in your map. We have the right to tweak those and maybe come up with a combined map. That's what I'm saying. We're not saying produce a new map. We say here are the objections. They present it to us, and as we work through these maps, maybe we can come up with a modified map.
But the argument could be submitted then by another map's author. Why wasn't I given the opportunity?
No, fair. Well, I'm saying everyone has the right to suggest tweaks to the maps. I guess that's what I would be saying about I, not present a wholesale new map, just tweaks. Is that fair? I mean, am I not being clear? I'll go to Mr. Schur, and then I'll come back to Mr. Bradshaw.
Well, 2 things. I share concerns about breaking up the Riverside Alliance as well, and but I think that the scoring on these maps is a little bit, it's not a good statistic. I applaud staff for trying to come up with one that would help us make a decision, but I do question the scoring mechanism. with respect to making changes to these maps, I mean, if someone submits a changed map with better boundaries, and that can include any of these map makers, if they submit one and at our session, we really like it, we see something in there that we really like, I suppose that, that would, if we accepting a whole new map that's not been approved thus far would be modifying, but we can still, I would think we could still do that. So I think that going back to the map makers, letting them, the top 6 that we've picked, and, really letting them make changes to adjust to what they've said, I think that that is what we should do, and I don't think we should throw out any of the 6 that we've picked.
And how much leeway, maybe I'm using the wrong terminology, but give us some guidance on what the council gave us in their resolution as to what can be done with maps submitted in terms of tweaks and modifications.
I would suggest, in the interest of fairness, that rather than turning back to the original authors, that you decide which is your preferred map and what features you want to emphasize, what features you want to improve, and then that working with our staff, particularly Michelle Swindle at your January 24th meeting, that you engage in an exercise to refine your preferred map. And in doing so, you could take map X, for example, but you like certain features of map S or map I or whatever, you could modify that map X in those ways. But I think that would be more fair than to ask the original author to make changes, because that, in effect, I think Mr. DeVito is right. It's giving that author an unfair advantage, and is changing the rules after the game is played.
Fair enough. Then, I mean, my view on I is take it out to the public, let everyone object, and we come back, we'll narrow it down and it can be voted down. In the meantime, let it go ahead and be analyzed. Yes, ma'am, Ms. Kennedy.
I don't think any of the authors of the maps are the winners or losers. The winners and losers are the citizens of Fort Worth. And so I think that however we modify maps to get to the one that makes all of our citizens the winners should be the procedure that we use. And I would hope that anyone who submitted a map would not be so prideful that they would care whether or not someone else got an opportunity to tweak a map in order for our community to have the most representative map for the city of Fort Worth.
Fair enough. Mr. Bradshaw.
Yeah, so I think I'm just kind of repeating what you guys said, maybe in a little bit different way. So anybody that drew a map or is interested in this whole process that is going to show up to council, you've got 3 minutes to make your point. So I think it would be great, if you've got, I want to solve, the things that have been mentioned here, the problems with map, X or Z or I or S or whatever, submit, here are the changes that would solve, problem X, Y, and Z, and problem A is just not solvable.
I think Mr. DeVito, Mr. Bradshaw, good points. Mr. Costa, Ms. Kennedy, everyone, your comments are right on point. So where we are is Fernando suggesting we have 6 maps, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, X, S, Q, U, I, Z.
I think in order they are X, Z, Q, M, I, and S.
Right, that's right. But there's 6 maps. Same again, Fernando?
The 6 maps in order of scoring are X, Z, Q, M, I, and S. And if I understand, based on all of your comments, that you would like for us to continue identifying these maps by these letter designations rather than by the author. The authors are not a secret. Anyone can determine who the authors are, but we're emphasizing the letter designation because, consistent with the comments from Ms. Kennedy, these maps all belong in the public realm now. We're trying to find the best geography, not necessarily awarding a trophy to a winning author.
Right. I think he meant you. One more time.
I stand corrected. It was you, yes.
Mr. DeVito, you are sharp today, sir. What is it? Those who prepare to fail, fail to prepare, but those who prepare well, succeed well.
Let me go back, if I may.
Go ahead, Fernando.
Let me go back, because M did get 12 points after Mr. Norris re-ranked his. So M is still on the list, but Mr. DeVito is correct. U did not change points, but it stayed at 12.
So we got 1, 2, 3, 4.
So now we can identify 5 maps.
All right, what are they?
X still has number 1 ranking with 24 points. Z is still at in the second slot with 15 points. Q is in the third spot with 14 points. And then we have a tie for fourth and fifth place at 12 points with M and U. And so I and S have 11 points each, and they would be 6th and 7th. So there are 5 that rise to the top. Thank you, Mr. DeVito, for that correction.
So we're going to go with 7 now?
So you either go with 5 or 7. I would suggest you go with 5, but it's up to the pleasure of the task force.
What's the task force pleasure? We've gone from 26 to 23 to 7. I'm trying to think, but S was one of the ones that the Park Glen and Stone Glen folks liked. And then, of course, you heard why I liked I and why certain groups like I. We're not making a decision on which maps we're going to vote for. We're talking about which maps are going out to the public. So, yes.
All maps are subject to discussion at the public hearing, but 7 would be, 5 or 7 would be subject to research as to legal compliance in minority opportunity districts. And since that is a lot of work and we're paying for it by the hour, I would recommend that you not ask for any more work than is necessary.
All right. So what's the task force pleasure? Mr. Herrera, you were going to say something?
I say leave it as 7. That's a lot less than 26.
I want to be inclusive rather than exclusive. We've done a lot of work. So I think we've done yeoman's work narrowing from 26 to 7. And, that's why the lawyers get paid money to do the citizen's duty. So, I agree with Mr. Herrera. 7. Mr. DeVito?
Just a few minutes ago, S was ranked really high, and in a matter of 5 minutes, it dropped, all the way off the charts. I don't think that's right.
I think we need to go out with S and I.
I would recommend.
All right, all right, so then if we're going to go with 7, I'll entertain a motion so we can wrap this up. Yes.
I would like to make a note that there is only one difference between Q and U. So I do think that excluding Q and just replacing it with U makes the most sense since we're trying to disregard maps and exclude them, that makes the most sense. Just putting it out there that as far as the data is concerned, there's one neighborhood, technically 2 neighborhoods that are different. That is the only difference.
So how many maps would we be, if we do that, what were the maps? 6?
I think that still puts you at 6.
And then what are the maps again? X? Give me again the maps.
If we do as Ms. Swindle is suggesting, that is to say, drop Q in favor of U, which is very similar.
Okay.
Then we would have in order of scoring X, Z, M and U are tied, I and S. We still have 6 maps, but we drop Q.
Well, yes, Mr. DeVito, and then I'll come to Ms. Boyd.
Just real quickly, rather than dropping Q, according to the scoring sheet here, we should probably be dropping U because it splits fewer, or the percentage of COI split is lower on Q than it is on U. Am I reading that correctly?
I don't have.
It's actually the same.
I've got percentage of COI split on Q as
I think we should leave
1.3 and on U as 2.6. There appears to be 2 COI split on U and only 1 on Q. Given that, I would say drop U then and not.
Well, it looks like, let's just leave all 7 in there and because I do remember that U was one of the maps that one of the groups also liked. So we're going out to the public with these 7 maps. Let them do their minority opportunity district analysis. We'll come back at the next meeting, after we do the public input, we're gonna have to, obviously gonna roll up our sleeves like we have right now. And already we know which ones are gonna be at the top in terms of after the public input, unless something, comes out. That's why there's 11 of us on this task force to represent the views of the citizens, and we're gonna hear from the citizens. And Ms. Kennedy made a good point in terms of, we wanna do what's right by the citizens and residents forward. And I think, let's just leave the 7 in there. Better to be inclusive than exclusive.
Agree.
All right, so let's do that.
Mr. Chair, would you like to entertain a motion to that
Yes,
effect?
will someone make a motion that maps X, Z, M, U, Q, I, and S be further evaluated by legal staff for compliance, of course, with the Voting Rights Act and for minority opportunity district analysis.
So moved.
And also, all right, moved by Ms. Kennedy. And these are also the maps, Ms. Kennedy, that will go out to the public for further input, right? Of course, they can comment on any map, right?
They may comment on any map, but we're asking for research on those 7. And I think you're clearly stating your intent to focus on those 7.
All right, is there a second? Second by Ms. Hermosillo. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Motion carries. All right. Task Force, you have done great work. Excellent debate, and I want to commend you. This is the way you do debate, civil, respectful. Too often in our polarized society, people don't disagree respectfully, and variety of viewpoints, and it should be, because we're a diverse city. We should have diverse viewpoints. So, all right, so our next meeting is next Thursday. It is the public hearing. Let's promote that. If we have social media, let's get a bunch of people. Ms. Boyd made a good point. Let's get people out here to comment. We're talking about what the boundaries are going to look for the next 10 years, right, for representation in our city. And then after that, we'll have a meeting Monday, January 24th, where we really have to work on the maps and get down to 1. So with that, one more, since we did move public presentations, is there anyone here that signed up late to make a public comment? Anybody signed up late? Okay, with that, we're adjourned. Thank you, task force members. I thought we were gonna be here a lot longer. Speaks to your efficiency.